What is a feast to a poor man? Is it quality? Is it quantity? Or is it just enough to get through the day? I'm sure that some of you have been in a situation where your family has had to stretch the food dollar. Maybe you've eaten a lot of spaghetti, or maybe you grew up like me and you had Spanish rice with hot dogs cut up in it. Poverty has always been a problem. It's been a problem for thousands of years. It's a problem today. In the 18th century, it was a very serious problem. Man, woman, child, every community, everyone has dealt with it. I want to make multiple dishes. In my mind, I'm picturing a poor family, and they need protein, and they need carbohydrates, they need sugars, they need a full experience and a full belly. There was an author who attacked this very idea. This author put together Primitive Cookery in 1767, and it's a compilation cookbook where he just took ideas from separate cookbooks and he put them all together, along with a list in the back of all the different kinds of dishes that you could make for 2 or 3 cents. This cookbook offers us a glimpse into the food of the poor, the best food of the poor. Come along with me as we prepare this feast for this poor family. Before we get to a poor man's feast, let's talk about what a poor man is eating day in, day out. Sometimes it's just bread and water. Primitive Cookery starts off with things like oatmeal, bread and butter, and a glass of water, bread and cheese. We have water gruel, we have boiled eggs. We also have things like pottages, where they would go out and find herbs in the field and just boil those up into a kind of a soup, and that's it. That's your meal for the day. When it comes to building a feast, a recipe that popped out right away was a recipe for Windsor beans. Let me read it to you. To dress Windsor beans, take the seed, boil them till they are tender, then blanch them, fry them in clarified butter, melt butter with a drop of vinegar, pour over them, strew them with salt, pepper, and nutmeg. This recipe is from Hannah Glass's cookbook, probably the most common English cookbook of the 18th century, very, very popular. And he just pulled this recipe right out. Hannah Glass did not write this. This is a medieval recipe. So in the 18th century, several 14th century manuscript cookbooks were printed. And in those manuscript cookbooks is a recipe almost exactly like this. So this is a medieval recipe for Windsor beans or broad beans. We know them as fava beans. The beans will give us wonderful carbohydrates and, of course, fiber. But what we really need in this feast is protein. Probably the least expensive and most flexible protein is going to be eggs. And eggs show up in our Primitive Cookery cookbook all over the place. We can cook them in fancy ways or simple ways. We can do them simply by dropping them in boiling water or even roasting them in the embers if we don't have any equipment at all. We're going to do a simple fried egg. I love eggs cooked that way, and I think they would have too. Where does our poor family get the ingredients for their feast? They don't have a supermarket like we do, but they do have the market. They'll go to the market at the end of the day when the vendors are selling out the last little bit they have that they don't want to take home, that they can get inexpensively or maybe even for free. It's likely that they're begging at times and they're getting handouts either from the church or just people around town. And there are circumstances where they would go out into the fields and glean or forage for whatever they could. We've got our fiber, we've got our protein. Now we need something for dessert. We need some sweetness in this dish. We're going to be using apples. Now they show up a lot for feeding workers and poor people. If you look at William Ellis's book in the 1750s, he talks about making apple puddings for field workers. Dish number 48, and it is apple dumplings, boiled, eat with butter. It's the best way of eating them. So we're going to be doing an apple dumpling. So simple, so easy. As I keep thinking more and more about this poor man's feast, an image pops into my mind, and that's Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, when the spirit of Ebenezer Scrooge watches the feast of the Cratchit family. And they're a very poor family. They're scratching together whatever they can get to fill the plates for that feast. And in that story, the feast is all about the people around the table. It has almost nothing to do with the food. And so later on in the story, when Scrooge comes and he brings the giant turkey, their feast doesn't get any better. It was already as good as it was ever going to get. And that rings so true if we read in the journals, diaries, and memoirs of soldiers and people going out into the frontier. And they're in situations where they don't have enough food, or it's unpalatable. And yet they still have a feast. Again, it's not about what's on the plates. It's about the people you're with. As I fill this plate with food for this poor man's feast, I'm looking for a win for this family. I want this to be nutritious. I want this to fill the belly. I want this plate to be full, and I want this possible. I want this to be something that could actually be done. To fill out this feast, we have a whole wheat loaf of bread, and to drink a small beer. After a hard day's work, even this cheap ale would be very, very refreshing. Our plate started off empty, now our plate is full. This is a victory. Everyone will go away from this satisfied. This is a doable, a possible meal for a poor person in the 18th century. This is a poor man's feast, and it is very good. Some days I just want to get away. Life is too complicated. I want to get in my wooden sailboat and sail away. That idea is nothing new. Hundreds of thousands of men in the 18th and early 19th century did exactly that same thing. And while they were able to get away from it all, they found themselves doing a job that was harder than imaginable. Every day I study the 18th and early 19th century. It's my job and I love it. For fun, I dig even deeper into shipboard life of this time period. The memoirs and books by the people who lived in the time period. Samuel Kelly, Spavins, Dana. These books are great, and they give us a glimpse of what sailors' life is like in that time period from actual sailors, not from somebody from the outside. If I really want to have fun, and what I do for fun is read and listen to the Patrick O'Brian novels, the Master and Commander series with Aubrey and Matron. You may know the Master and Commander movie. I love it. This common sailor's life is fascinating. What always amazes me is the work that these common sailors have to do. It is probably the most difficult and dangerous job in this time period, and it was done by hundreds of thousands of men. They are working before the age of steam. They've got nothing to propel these ships but sails and ropes. And these ships are very fragile, and they're putting them into the most dangerous circumstances on the earth, dealing with horrible storms, rocks you can't see. It's just incredible that anybody survives at all. And they do this over and over and over again every day of their lives. Sometimes it's the most monotonous thing ever and nothing happens. And then 10 minutes later, they're fighting for their lives, literally. Sometimes after a storm or maybe a battle, or just before you're coming into a port, there are opportunities when the sailor has a chance to have a feast, to have a special meal. They may not have anything different than they've ever had with their typical rations, but they do have an opportunity to combine things they normally wouldn't to make a special meal, to make a feast. That's what we're doing today. So the first dish for our hardworking and hungry sailors is going to be a peas pudding. Now, they're eating peas pudding at least once a week, and sometimes every single day. But their peas pudding, this everyday peas pudding, is just these dried peas boiled in a bag. That's it. That's peas pudding, nothing special. Ours is going to be a little bit more special. We're going to take our peas, we're going to boil them for about a half hour or so. Then we're going to take them out of their bag. We're going to add some butter right into the middle of this clump and a bunch of salt and pepper. And then we're going to close that back up and boil it some more, another half hour or so. And it's going to make this wonderful infused flavor inside of this peas pudding, which is normally a very, very plain dish. They didn't get butter every day. They got butter maybe once a week. So this is special to be able to add pepper and salt and butter into this peas pudding. It's going to give it a great flavor. This dish goes by a couple of different names. Peas pudding, of course, or dog's body, which the sailors more likely would have used. In Samuel Kelly's memoir, as an 18th century sailor, he speaks of peas pudding. He says, "Our daily food from month to month was only beef and peas pudding for dinner and for supper." One of the most important aspects of getting a ship ready for sea is provisioning. You have to have the supplies on board to feed all the men for the trip you're about to take, and probably times two, because you don't know how long your trip might take. Sometimes your average trip might take 3 or 4 weeks, and then another time of year, it might take 4 months. So you have to have lots and lots of provisions on board. What are the provisions? You're going to have salt meat, so salt beef and salt pork. You're going to have lots and lots of sea bread, or ship's biscuit. We know it today as hardtack. You'll even have a special room on board the ship, tin lined, so that the rats can't get in, that you store all this bread in. It's got to stay dry. We also have other kinds of provisions: oatmeal, dried peas. We're going to have butter and cheese. So the dish I'm most excited about here is the main dish, lobscouse. It's got a fun name to it. It's one of those names that nobody's quite sure where it comes from, but it is classic lobscouse from the 18th century. The main component here in lobscouse is something like salt pork, which the sailors are eating a couple of days out of every single week. We're going to take some onion, again, kind of a special treat for sailors, and we're going to take that onion and brown it a little bit in a frying pan. I'm going to toss in potatoes. Again, a special treat for a sailor. We're going to put in some diced up potato into these onions. Once it's cooked up, can go into our pot. A pot of water with some chopped up salt pork in it. If we're using salt pork, we want to start off with the water cold. If we were making our lobscouse with fresh pork, well, we'd put those pork pieces in with those onions and brown them. Toss them into the hot water already boiling. We're gonna let those boil a half hour or so, maybe a little bit longer, and then comes the extra special part of lobscouse, and that is ship's biscuits. Ship's biscuits are the thing that sailors get each and every day. Almost a pound of ship's biscuits each and every day, and ship's biscuits are almost inedible in the state that you would get them. These are just flour and salt, a little bit of water. You knead them up into these hard little biscuit shapes, and they get baked at a very low temperature for a very long time. You're driving out all the moisture. They last a long time. They do go bad, and bugs and weevils find their way into them, but the sailor's going to eat them anyway. The ship's biscuit is going to thicken and add texture to our lobscouse. Right now it's just a soup, but this will go in and give it a real stew texture. The small parts just thicken it, the bigger parts will stay nice and chunky. They'll add to it. They'll make it seem like we have twice as much meat as what's really in here. We find lobscouse showing up in dictionaries and literary works in the 18th and 19th century. And we never find it in a cookbook. You're not going to find it there because sailors aren't writing down their recipes. But the dictionary reference here in the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue from 1788 gives us a quick snapshot. What is lobscouse? It says, a dish much eaten at sea, composed of salt beef, biscuit and onions, well peppered and stewed together. These two main dishes are ready, the dog's body, peas pudding, and the lobscouse. And let's give this just a little try. This is not something I eat every day, that's for sure. But you can tell this one's special with that buttery flavor and the salt and pepper infused in it. This is what I really want to make sure to test. This is the lobscouse. Oh, that's so good. This is going to be completely different than what a sailor gets each and every day. A different texture. It's got a different mixture of things all put together, cooked in a way that you don't get every day. This is really, really good. We've got our vegetables. We have our meat, our protein, but we need dessert. We need to set this off. So we're going to make the sailor's delight. They called it plum duff. It is a boiled pudding made with flour, sometimes with suet or with slush from the ship's galley, and the sweetness, raisins. They would have pounds and pounds of raisins just for this dish. There are truly some harrowing stories from this time period written by the sailors themselves. In Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, he talks about coming around Cape Horn and just how incredibly difficult it was, having to run up on deck in the middle of the night. You don't know exactly when. You haven't slept more than 4 hours no matter what. The decks are icy. You have to climb icy rope ladders 100 feet above the deck and bring in a sail that's as hard as a board because it's frozen solid. Again, without a single light to see by in the middle of the night. And then you have to come down on deck. And is there anything to eat? Well, if the weather's been really bad, you can't light the galley fires. So there's no warm food. I can't even imagine it. For a meal, we have to have a drink. What did the sailors want? They wanted grog. In home waters, they got a gallon of beer a day, but that wasn't what they really wanted. Once they were out of home waters, they got grog, which was rum mixed with water, 3-to-1. That's the drink they wanted. It's the drink we're gonna have for our feast. These men were not well paid. They were drawn from the lower classes, and yet they were asked to do an impossible job, probably the most dangerous and difficult job of the time period. And without them, we would have no 13 colonies. We wouldn't have overseas commerce in any shape or form. The world would look completely different and much, much poorer. This is a wonderful feast. Our sailors are going to love this. It makes me want to buy a ship. We're here because of you. We did this recipe 10 years ago, and we've gotten so many wonderful comments, and it is such a good recipe, we have to do it again. Mushroom ketchup is one of the most incredible forgotten recipes from the 18th century. Okay, forgotten in North America. It's very common still in Great Britain, but we have lost out here. We need mushroom ketchup in our lives. As an American citizen, when I hear the word ketchup, I think of this. We don't want that. We want mushroom ketchup. This is what ketchup was in the 18th century. If you look it up in the dictionary, it says a sauce made of mushrooms. It doesn't have anything to do with tomatoes. In fact, they thought mostly that tomatoes were poisonous. Why would you make a tomato jam? Because that's like half sugar anyway. Why would you make that and put it on your food when you could have this wonderful mushroom ketchup? The question is, where does ketchup really come from? It was a sauce that was brought over from China and India into Great Britain in the 17th century, at the very end of that century. And that's when you start to see references to it. Now, they don't know what it is actually made out of. In fact, if they knew what that kind of sauce was made out of, they probably wouldn't have eaten it. But they try to make an emulation of it. They say, well, how can we make this? So they start to experiment and make this mushroom powder sauce stuff that is really, really good. And it starts to show up in recipe books, English recipe books, in the middle of the 18th century, about 1750. Hannah Glass has a recipe for it, and multiple other cookbooks. It really just starts to proliferate because they can't afford the real sauce from China. They need to make their own. Some people make it and sell it in the stores, but a lot of people make it at home. Because of the availability of mushrooms in the marketplace, or even getting them in the wild, this sauce would be able to show up on anyone's table, whether you're a very rich person or very poor. The main component of mushroom ketchup is obviously mushrooms. Now, we could go into the wild and pick mushrooms. That doesn't make any sense at all. Wild mushrooms, if they're edible, are wonderful, and you don't want to waste them on a product like mushroom ketchup. We're going to go into the store and we're going to get button mushrooms or brown mushrooms, any common mushrooms. If you want to make special ones, you could use shiitakes and some other fancy mushrooms. Generally, again, it's not worth it. Standard button mushrooms are going to give you an amazing flavor. There are many, many recipes in the 18th century for this. I picked out one to base our recipe on. Harriet Pinckney Horry's cookbook manuscript. It's American, from the middle of the 1770s. And her recipe goes something like this: making mushroom ketchup and powder. Gather your mushrooms early in the morning. Wipe them very clean with a woolen cloth and then mash them with your hands. Strew on them a handful of salt and let them lie all night. Then put them on a fire for 10 minutes, keeping them constantly stirring. Then squeeze them through a canvas and let them settle. Then put in it whole pepper, cloves, mace, ginger, allspice, salt. Let it be high seasoned. Boil one part of it away and then bottle it when it's cold. The first thing we're gonna do is wash our mushrooms, and then we can just crush them up into a nice large bowl. We're gonna make a fairly large batch. You don't wanna make this a little bit at a time. Once our salt is mixed in, we can already see that it's starting to pull the moisture out. We're going to cover this up and set it aside overnight. Some of the recipes call for this to be setting 9 and 10 days. It's not going to get any better after overnight, so that's what we're going to do. These have broken down overnight very nicely. A lot of moisture here. We're going to smash these a little bit and then put them over the fire to release extra flavor. The recipe doesn't call for the spices to go into this mixture until after it comes off the fire. In fact, after it's strained out. But we have a special surprise for this recipe, so we are going to change it up just a little bit, and the spices are going to go in now before it goes on the fire. And the spices I have are long pepper, mace, cloves. I've got some nutmeg, of course, you gotta have nutmeg, and some allspice, maybe even a couple of slices of ginger. The recipes are all over the place. Some of the recipes just say highly spice this. So this is your chance to make your special mixture. You can put in whatever wonderful spices you like. When researching ketchup, you will be able to find it being made out of other things. Certainly not tomatoes, but Things like anchovies and walnuts are a popular kind of ketchup. It's also difficult sometimes researching ketchup because it's spelled in at least 5 different ways, if not even more. We know ketchup with a K and ketchup with a C, but sometimes it's ketchup or it's ketchup. It's so strange when you're doing this research. There is no standardized spelling. As an 18th century scholar, I really wonder how we go from this wonderful mushroom ketchup of the 18th century into this strange tomato ketchup that we have today. Somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, it all changes and we move from, again, mushrooms to tomatoes. This is tasting really good. Spicy, salty. I love this flavor and a little bit of that earthiness of the mushroom. This is ready to go back on the fire for 15, 20 minutes, even a half hour to let it simmer. If you wanted to really thicken it up or at least make it more concentrated, you can let it simmer an hour or longer and then let it cool and it's time to bottle it. Our mushroom ketchup is ready to use. And if your equipment and your bottle was properly sterilized, this can last probably up to 2 years in a bottle like this. Now, we can use it in any number of wonderful recipes, but today we're going to try this out on steaks. We have our steak with our mushroom ketchup. Let's find out how this batch turned out. It's superb. Of course, the steak turned out great. You can't go wrong with that. And the mushroom ketchup gives it just that kind of flavor you really, really want. The salt, the spices, and that earthiness of the mushrooms. It's such a wonderful, complex flavor that it adds a lot to just about anything you put it on. Now remember the surprise I was talking about earlier. What do you do with the mushrooms when you're done? You don't throw those out. No way. You spread those out on a cookie sheet, you put them in the oven at a low temperature, 200, 250 degrees, and you let them dry. You get them nice and crispy, then you pulverize it into this powder. It's called mushroom powder, and it is a spice all by itself. It's sort of like condensed mushroom ketchup that you can bring in and use it on a different kind of dish. Something like scrambled eggs. Perfect. And it is over the top. I love mushroom powder. Here are scrambled eggs with mushroom powder. And I love scrambled eggs anyway. And with the mushroom powder, just to the right addition of saltiness, earthiness. It's just like mushroom ketchup, but even better if you ask me. Speaking of scrambled eggs, you're going to love this recipe. Go check it out. Imagine you're a young man and you have your whole life ahead of you. You have everything you need, you're never hungry, but you know war is headed your way. Like so many young men around you, you feel it is your duty to take up arms and support your country in battle. It's not long before things look very bleak. Food is scarce, the men are tired, the living conditions are unfathomable. You quickly realize if you're going to be victorious and win this war, you simply have to survive the day. Have you ever made a decision that you knew was the right thing to do, but it was going to cause you a lot of pain, a lot of sacrifice? Joseph Plum Martin was a soldier during the Revolutionary War, and he wrote his experiences about what it was like to be a common soldier. So many times we get the big repercussions and we get to hear about generals, but very rarely the story of an individual soldier. What was life like for someone who actually was fighting in that battle? What he feared most was not the battles, but the deprivations, the lack of clothing, the lack of shelter, the lack of water, even the lack of food. We marched from thence and crossed the Delaware again between Burlington and Bristol. Here we procured a day's rations of southern salt pork, 3/4 of a pound, and a pound of sea bread. We marched a little distance and stopped to refresh ourselves. We kindled some fires in the road, and some broiled their meat. As for myself, I ate mine raw. We did not pitch our tents, and about midnight it began to rain very hard, which soon put out all our fires, and we had to lie and weather it out. Even after suffering hunger and freezing conditions, after 6 months his term of service was over and he went home. He enjoyed all the luxuries of home, and yet, when it was time and the war was continuing, he signed back up, knowing he was going to suffer all those for the rest of the war. There were but 3 of our men present. We had our cooking utensils, at that time the most useless things in the army, to carry in our hands. They were made of cast iron and consequently heavy. I was so beat out before morning with hunger and fatigue that I could hardly move 1 foot before another. I told my messmates that I could not carry our kettle any further. They said they would not carry it any further. And of what use was it? They had nothing to cook and did not want anything to cook with. At the beginning of the war, the soldiers were told that their rations every day would be a pound of meat and a pound of bread. But as we dig into the narrative, we find that he very rarely gets supplied a pound of meat and a pound of bread. In fact, he complains that even when they got a so-called pound of meat, it was usually 3/4 of a pound of meat, and that was half bones. We drew a day's ration of beef and flour, what was called a pound each. The flour perhaps was not far from its nominal weight, but the beef was, as it always was in such cases, and indeed in all others in the army, not more than 3/4 of a pound, and that at least half bone. And how was it cooked? Why, as it usually was when we had no cooking utensils with us. That is, the flour was laid upon a flat rock and mixed up with cold water and then daubed onto a flat stone and scorched on one side, while the beef was broiled on a stick in the fire. So what does he do when he doesn't get that ration? And he so often does not get that ration. Many times he's just going hungry for days at a time. He talks about 24 hours, 48 hours, 3 days without food. And they scrounge up whatever they can. Sometimes it is disgusting. And other times it's something in the field, turnips, carrots, or potatoes. After one long march, when they expected to go into battle but nothing happened, they didn't have anything to eat, he went off into the woods and he found a few walnuts, cracked them open, and ate the meats. That's all he had, but he was happy. That day he did win. There were times when it got to be too much, when there was so little food that the men could not stand it any longer and there was a mutiny. They would not obey. And it took a lot of effort by the officers to bring them back under control. They wanted to offer them food, but there was still none to offer at that time. As we go from page to page in the narrative, it can be kind of a misery because every day is such a struggle for him. And yet sometimes miraculous things happen. He was taking a boat from one shore to another. They were taking equipment across, and to their amazement, this huge fish jumps into the boat. They're taken aback. Things like that just don't happen. They truly had a victory that day. Today in this camp, it's a good day. We've got a little bit of bony meat, we've got a carrot, and we've got some ship's biscuits. We're gonna make a simple stew. Joseph Plum Martin's job was not to win the war. That was George Washington's job. Joseph's job was to survive the day. You are the most important person in town. You hold your local society together. The men and women in your community who work every day to feed their families depend on you. Without you, people will go hungry, even homeless. There would be civil unrest, riots in the streets, if it wasn't for your constant routine. The very fabric of humanity is woven together by your hands. Can you believe all of this is because of bread? As a baker, you have a responsibility to your community to be able to bake this bread, bake it well, bake it to a certain standard. And in many situations, the baker took an oath in front of the community because this is the most important job in the world. Not just anyone can become a baker. You almost have to be born into the trade. Many people started off as an apprentice. And not just anyone can be an apprentice. You really have to be strong enough for this trade. You're carrying around heavy sacks of flour. You're carrying around huge baskets of bread in the streets to sell them. You start off young as a baker. Bakers in a community are part of a guild. So much so that they even turn out for parades and they're all together and dressed all in the same way in a uniform. And in this guild situation, the bakers in the community have to compete against one another, but also support one another as they work within that community. Why was the baker important? Why didn't people just bake bread at home? Not everyone has an oven in their home. In fact, most people don't have an oven in their home, and they certainly can't afford to fire it every day. It takes a lot of fuel to fire up a little tiny oven. The baker has a huge oven. He has to start that oven up in the morning, but it bakes for the entire town. And not just bread, but people will bring other things to the baker to have them bake. You might bring a big cake. You might bring a whole haunch of venison. The customer is everyone in town, from the richest house to the poor house. And it's interesting that there's a loaf of bread that represents each level of society. Whether it's the most refined bread for the rich person's table or the coarsest dark loaf for the poor house. The reason why bread is so important is it's the one thing the everyday man can survive upon. And he doesn't need to cook it. He can just buy it and eat it, and that's it. That's all he really has to have. We will find journal entries where an author will talk about a meal that seems very complete, and he will complain about the lack of bread. That's how important it was. As the baker, you're required to bake 3 kinds of bread for the community. You bake a white bread, sometimes called fine bread. You bake a middling bread, and sometimes it's called middling or just wheaten bread. And then a low-class bread, a cheap bread, brown bread, and it was generally called household bread. Here's our fine wheat bread. This is the one everybody wants. And it's sort of a plain bread. You expect to put butter on this. It's not full of flavor. This is our wheaten bread, the middling bread, the less expensive bread. And it has that nice wheat flavor. It's a little more dense. It's actually more flavorful. We come down to the very inexpensive household bread. This is the bread poor people can actually afford. It's less than half the price. And it is a dense meal. It is full of flavor. It's got that wonderful bran that comes through, which is the thing that gets thrown out of the white bread. You're getting the full meal in a slice of bread. As the baker, you face many challenges, and one of the foremost is regulation. Bread has been regulated for thousands of years. The Romans regulated bread, and they're regulating many different aspects. Exactly what goes in your bread. Is it white bread? Is it brown bread? Is it household bread? And you're regulating the weight of the bread. Your bread has to weigh a certain amount. Your bread also has to be a particular price. And your bread has to be marked. Each and every loaf has to have an initial on it, who you are as the baker. It also has to say what kind of bread it is, and it might even say how much the bread is supposed to weigh. And if you don't put these marks on your bread may be forfeit and given to the poorhouse. There are also challenges with seasonality and supply. Bread is very difficult to bake if it's too cold outside. You need to proof your bread, that yeast needs to work, and if it's too cold, it just will not rise. Yeast is a problem when it's cold or it's warm. The brewer, where the yeast comes from, he's giving you yeast at the best time of year, either in the spring or more likely in the fall. But when it gets to be cold winter time, he's not brewing beer and you don't have a supply of yeast. There were times when yeast was in great demand and it was very difficult to get a hold of. You will have problems getting a hold of flour. We have crop failures. Maybe the weather is cold or wet and the wheat crop is a failure. And the flour that finally comes to you is a very low quality and hardly works for bread at all. The baker has to be quick on his feet. He has to be able to make substitutions, still within the law, and bake bread for people who want it every single day. If you do not get people the bread that they require, there will be civil unrest, and at times even violence against your shop and your person because they want bread now. And there are even bread riots recorded throughout history. It's one of the reasons why bread is regulated so tightly. As the baker, what do you do when you can't get enough flour to bake your bread or it's too expensive? This happens many times, and there are certain things you can do. Most of them, well, they don't quite meet with all the regulations. You can add other kinds of flour in. Maybe you're going to add barley flour or rye flour into your bread. It isn't exactly what the regulations say, but in certain circumstances, it's the only thing you can do. There are other times when you add things into your bread to make them look whiter. So they would add alum to the bread, or they would add chalk to the bread. There might be several reasons to do this. Sometimes you're just putting an inexpensive ingredient in and one that weighs a lot so that you can make your bread cheaper. Or if you can't get enough wheat, you might add that chalk to it so that it actually rises better. It's against the law. If you get caught, you will be punished. If a baker or brewer be guilty not to have observed the assize for the first, second, or third fault, he shall be fined, except for the offense be grievous and often, and then shall the baker to the pillory. The reality is that bakers breaking the law isn't all that common. This profession is one that is very fulfilling. The community needs bread.
I just love the crust when it comes out of the earthen oven. It's so different than anything else.
You can smell a difference when it comes out of the earthen oven, and the texture is different. I think it has to do with that trapped moisture that you just don't get in a modern oven. Bakers were looked up to because of what they provided to the community. You're providing nutrition, fuel for the working man, survival for the poor. What you do is truly the most important job in the world.
Wow, I don't remember the last time I ate so much bread.
You and I are on a mission. We've traveled back in time and we've met a very important person. Let's call him George. So he asks us, what do 21st century Americans eat? We look at each other. What's the obvious answer? Pizza, that's the obvious answer. You can get it any place. You can get it at a gas station. You can get it delivered. You can get gourmet pizza or the simplest pizza in the world. So how can we show George what 21st century American pizza is like? And that's our mission. We're searching for the perfect pizza. Our time machine has landed us in 1790, and all we have with us are the clothes on our back. We have to make do with the ingredients that we can find here in the late 18th century to make something like a pizza. It's quite likely that George has never even heard of the term pizza, but if he has, he thinks of it as an Italian dish that might have cheese and is very, very much a sweet pastry. Nowadays in America, it's a completely different dish. It's savory. It has this amazing crust. It has tomato sauce. It has pepperoni. It has, well, whatever you want on it. Even pineapple. There are certain ingredients they are not using in the time period. They will not have tomato sauce. They don't have the same kind of ground meats that we do. They certainly don't have a pizza crust like we would expect. So we've got to come up with those things. Let's start off with the foundation of our pizza, the crust. Pizza crust is a flatbread. There are not very many flatbreads that are in America in the 18th century. There are things like journey cakes, sort of like a corn pancake. I don't think that would make a very good pizza crust. But there is something that George Washington would be very, very familiar with, and that would be fire cakes. Soldiers in the 18th century were given a ration of flour quite often instead of bread. And what would they do with flour in the field? They couldn't bake bread. They had no equipment for that. So they would mix their flour with a little bit of salt, a little bit of water. They'd make a simple dough, and they would spread that out thin and cook it right on the coals of the fire. I am sure George has had many a fire cake in his lifetime. That's what we're going to use for our crust. Our next problem is the sauce. We expect tomato sauce, but they just did not use tomatoes in 18th century North America. You will find a very, very occasional reference, but most people think that tomatoes or love apples are actually poison, and maybe that's because of the acid in the tomatoes bringing out lead in pewter plates. Maybe it's just because they're part of the nightshade family. I'm not sure the answer to that. Other cultures are using tomatoes, so you will find them being used in Italy and in France and in Spain, but the English and the Americans just aren't very interested in them at all. So we can't use a tomato paste sauce for our pizza. What we need though is something that's savory, that's got some umami, that has a texture that blends all these things together. We're going to take a classic from the 18th century, mushroom ketchup. It is not thick like our ketchup that we expect today. It's very watery, so we're going to have to thicken this up by adding some flour to it to make it into a paste. This mushroom sauce has a really nice mushroomy smell to it. It's got a little saltiness. It's got that sour tang, which is what we want. It's very similar to what they use as a barbecue sauce in this time period. We have to have meat for our pizza, so we're going to be using some force meat. That's like sausage, but it's ground very, very finely. Also, the classic, instead of pepperoni, we wanted a salty meat. We've got salt pork. Again, something that George would be very, very familiar with. We're going to slice this nice and thin. Our pizza is ready to assemble. All the ingredients are here. We have our crust, we have a sauce, we have a couple of different meats, we have vegetables, also mushrooms, and for cheese, we're going to be using Parmesan, very popular in the 18th century. I'm feeling good about all these ingredients except for the sauce. That's the sticking point. I just don't know if it's gonna work. Tomato sauce in a pizza, it brings so much flavor, it brings umami and sourness, and it ties the whole pizza together. And I just don't know if this sauce is gonna make it. It's a little too much like gravy. I don't know. Maybe it'll all work out, and maybe the cheese will help tie it together. I don't want to disappoint George. I mean, we came all this way. I hope this turns out well. This pizza is perfect. It doesn't need another thing. I was really concerned about this, but I can't believe how well it turned out. The crust, I'm hoping will turn out not too tough because the fire cakes can be a little tough. And that sauce, that's the thing we really have to worry about. But the smells on everything else, perfect. Totally pizza-like. It's time to try this out. We did it. You and I succeeded. We created a pizza I didn't think was possible with the ingredients we have. This is wonderful flavor. You'd like it today, and I'm sure George is gonna like it. Salt pork is one of the most misunderstood food ingredients of our 18th century time period. They ate tons and tons and tons of salt pork. The question is, how do you cook it? What do you use it in? You know, if you dig around in the cookbooks in the 18th century, English, American cookbooks, you don't find salt pork showing up very often. Well, today's recipe is an American recipe from 1796. It includes salt pork, and I think it'll give us a great idea of just how salt pork shows up in certain kinds of recipes. Today's recipe comes from Amelia Simmons' American Cookery Cookbook from 1796. And this recipe is not easy. Just like one I did a couple of episodes ago, which was very confusing, this recipe is going to take some interpretation. And it's got an interesting title, one that when I did digging, I could find no other recipes with this title, a stew pie. A stew pie, is this like stew, like a pie? Is this a pie? Is this a stew? Good question. Good question. It starts off by boiling a shoulder of veal. Now, we're not going to be using veal today because in the time period, they would use veal a lot because it was the only tender beef kind of product. Our beef is very tender. There's no reason to use veal in this circumstance. Luckily, though, it does say boil a shoulder of veal, so it's actually giving us an amount. We have our shoulder of veal. We salt and pepper it, and we put some butter in there, and then it has slices of raw salt pork. Notice they bother to tell us, you don't need to cook this salt pork ahead of time. You already cooked the veal. We're gonna be using raw salt pork, and in this, we're making a layer of meat, a layer of biscuit, a layer of meat again. We're covering the pot up close, and we are stewing it half an hour or so in 3 quarts of water. So even in this recipe, we don't even know what this is. She doesn't tell us exactly what she means by the cooking method here and what it should look like when it's done. So our first step in this recipe is to get our beef boiling. I'm gonna do that right now. She implies boiling it whole. In this case, and with this piece of beef, I'm gonna cut it up and boil it. It'll boil a little faster that way. Let me read this recipe in full so we can interpret it a little bit more. A stew pie. Boil a shoulder of veal and cut up, salt and pepper and butter 1/2 pound, and slices of raw salt pork. Make a layer of meat and a layer of biscuit or biscuit dough into the pot, cover close, stew 1/2 hour in 3 quarts of water. The recipe right after this is a sea pie. Now, if you go back on our channel, you'll find the sea pie recipe, and it has layers of meat and biscuit in it, but it's done completely differently. This sea pie, you like build up in a pan and you seal it and then you boil the whole pan. This, I don't think is that at all. I think this is like we would think of a stew that has biscuit dough in it. That's all that it is. And we have the quantity of veal, we have the quantity of butter. It doesn't say how much salt pork we need. It doesn't say how much biscuit we need. And then it does say how much water it gets put in the pan so that it doesn't turn out too much like soup, but turns out more like a stew. While our meat is boiling, we need to work on sort of another component here, and that is the biscuit dough. It either calls for already cooked biscuit, which I'm not sure exactly what it would be like, or biscuit dough. And we do have a biscuit recipe in here, which again is kind of rare. This is the first American cookbook, and biscuits don't show up like this in other cookeries. So it gives us an idea of biscuits. The biscuit recipe is pretty simple. A pound of flour, 1 ounce of butter, 1 egg, wet with milk, break while oven is heating, and in the same proportion. Oh yeah, what a minute, what? Okay, let me try this again. We have flour, we have butter, we have an egg, and we have milk. Okay, that seems like a very simple dough, and it doesn't have any leavening. Break, which actually means knead it. So you knead this while your oven is getting up to heat. And in the 18th century, you're heating with a brick oven that takes maybe hours to heat up. Instead of, today's ovens, you just set a knob. Nope, not anything like that. So you're kneading this, and then I'm not sure what this whole second section is, or this last little phrase, and in the same proportion. So I'm not gonna worry about, or we're not gonna worry about that part. But we just need to make the dough anyway. So let's make some dough with flour, butter, egg, and a little milk. And the ratio, it's a lot of flour and just a little bit of butter. This recipe has eggs. This is the first time we have used eggs from the chickens on the homestead. These are homestead eggs ready to use in the recipe. We're going to use one of these in our biscuit. We've got our dough that's all put together. I rolled it out nice and thin so that I can use it to assemble our stew pie. We're going to set this aside. Of course, I've got the meat. It's been boiled, and I've separated it out, the water and the meat, again, to help us assemble it. The salt pork is something a little special in this, and it's going to give us the pop or the bite in this particular recipe. Now, the salt pork coming out of your salt pork container, Of course, it's all covered with salt and it's way too salty. We want some of that salt flavor. That's exactly what we're looking for in this dish, but we can't have all of that salt flavor. So we're gonna take our salt pork and soak it overnight, or I've started soaking these two pieces here early this morning, so it'll have time to get the very, very surface salt off, or else it's just a little too strong. Now you're probably saying, I don't have salt pork, just, you know, in the cellar like everyone in the 18th century did. You can make your own salt pork. You know, you buy the pork cut and you salt it for just a couple of days and you'll get the salt pork effect. And again, this is salt pork like they would have had in the 18th century. You can sometimes find a salt pork in the grocery store today. It's not exactly the same thing at all. So make sure to go back and check out our salt pork episode. You can see us making salt pork and you know kind of what it's like. Assembling our stew pie. So we've got some beef pieces in here, and I'm just going to toss in beef pieces. We want to kind of fill in the bottom layer. We're going to put in beef pieces and then some salt pork, and about half. So you probably want to put in, because we're just going to have 2 layers here. Spread it evenly because we want these flavors to all kind of spread out properly. We're going to put in a few pieces of butter now with our meat, and we're going to pepper this. All right? It calls for salt and pepper. Generally, there's enough salt that comes in with the salt pork that we don't need to add that. But a nice, generous helping of black pepper sprinkled on top. Now we have some of our biscuit dough, and I've made this into kind of thin pieces I've cut so they're like noodles. So about half of it I made into a big sheet. The half of it is in these thinner pieces. So this in-between layer, we're going to use these little chunks. We make them little chunks because if we put in a big sheet here, it makes it hard to eat. And while the top, we don't mind kind of peeling that away, the middle stuff, we want to be able to eat the individual pieces without sawing them into bits. Now our next layer, put in the beef pieces again on top of the pieces we just put in. And now I'm just going to do all the rest of it because this is just 2 layers. If our pot was smaller around, then we might do 3 or 4 layers. Now the rest of our salt pork that we've cut up, the last of our butter here, a couple more chunks. You know it's going to be good with this much butter in it, right? There we go. Butter. A little bit more pepper on the very top of this. It does call for stewing this in the water. That's why I saved back what I boiled the beef in. I didn't want to lose any of those flavors. She doesn't call for this step specifically, but I've got almost the perfect ratio here. This is about a 1/3 recipe. She calls for 3 quarts. We've got 1 quart of this beef broth that we're going to pour in at this point, and then our last step. As the directions call for, it gets a tight lid on it. We want to hold all those juices in. We don't want it boiling out. And this just gets cooked, as she calls it, a half hour. So it stews, so on a low boil for a half hour. You could probably even, since we've got raw pork in there, raw salt pork, maybe 40 minutes. Let's get this on the fire. Our stew pie is done. And it turned out like I expected, although it's really hard. It's got salt pork and it's got beef in here, but you can't tell the difference, at least by looking at it, right? Question is, what do the individual pieces of meat taste like? So we've got our wonderful stew broth here. Ooh, really, really, really good. A nice level of saltiness. You know, with that salt pork in here, I did not need to add any salt. Great beef flavor. Our biscuit dough turns out like giant noodles, like I expected it to. Let me see if I can find something I know is salt pork. Where are you? It's very tricky here. It's probably a smaller cut up piece. Slightly different texture. The two kinds of meats melt together and give you really the best of both worlds on that. So very, very good. This is stew like they would have connected stew in the late 18th century. And wow, it's really good. What a great recipe that uses salt pork just like they would have had in the 18th century. And so much better than I expected. I mean, you know, stew, but this turned out great. So I want to try this one again. Great recipe for when it's cold outside like right now. You want to warm up, you want something to, you know, give you energy. Great recipe. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. You and I are on a mission. We've traveled back in time and we've met a very important person. Let's call him Ben. So he asks us, what do 21st century Americans eat every day? And we look at each other and we say, cheeseburgers. You can spend a few dollars on a value meal cheeseburger or spend literally thousands on a gourmet cheeseburger from a fancy restaurant. How can we have Ben experience a true 21st century cheeseburger? Our time machine has landed us in 1774, and all we have are the clothes on our back. We have to make do with the ingredients we can find here in the late 18th century. They don't know what a cheeseburger is. They don't even know what a sandwich is, so we have a lot of work to do on this. The recipes in this time period don't give us anything very, very close, so we've got to work on the techniques, we got to find the ingredients. We want to make this special. We're going to need a bun. We're going to need some kind of incredible meat patty. We'll need cheese. We'll need some kind of toppings. Got to have a special sauce, and it'll need a little something on the side, but we'll get to that later. Some of these ingredients will be easy, other ones will take some work. Let's start off with the foundation, the bun. We might think it was impossible to find a hamburger bun in this time period, but it turns out from Ben's own writing, we know that he was familiar with something similar. The day he shows up, his first day in Philadelphia, he goes to the baker. He wants to buy a biscuit. They don't have anything like that. He says, give me a 3-penny loaf. They don't have that either. He says, give me whatever for 3 pennies. And he gets 3 big puffy rolls, probably exactly like big hamburger buns. Also, if we look in the paintings of the time period, we'll find pictures of manchet bread, and they look exactly like hamburger buns. They even bake them all stuck together so that you have to peel them apart, just like a hamburger bun. The recipe for these buns is just like any other bread. Flour, salt, yeast, water. We let it rise, and then we have our bun. The heart of our cheeseburger is the meat patty. Sounds easy? It's not easy in the 18th century. Ground beef isn't done. Not in the way we think of it, because they didn't invent the meat grinder until the 1840s. What are we going to find that gets close to that? Well, there's an incredible recipe from Hannah Glass, 1774. It's called Hamburg sausage. Whoa, Hamburg sausage. Sounds pretty close, doesn't it? Take a pound of beef, mince it very small with a half a pound of beef suet. This is not going to be a lean patty, right? We're gonna add in pepper and cloves and nutmeg, a great quantity of garlic cut small. Garlic in a recipe in the 18th century? Pretty rare. We also have salt and vinegar. We have a glass of wine and a glass of rum. This should be incredible. This is mixing up really well. It smells great, and we haven't even started cooking it. I'm excited about that. And you know, we're not gonna add the liquid parts of the recipe because that original recipe was made to go inside of a sausage skin. And this isn't meant to be like that. So we're not gonna need the wine or the rum to go in here. The technique that gets closest to our meat patty in the 18th century was called force meat. They would take meat, they would mince it up very, very small, and then they would put it in a mortar and pestle, and they would grind it until it was almost a pate. Then they would take that, make little meatballs with it, and use it as a garnish. That's about as close as it gets. We want this to be the best burger. That means it's got to have tomatoes. Now that's a major problem here in the 18th century. In North America and in Great Britain, people just didn't eat tomatoes. They thought they were poisonous. Don't ask me why. Maybe it has to do with lead in the plates. Maybe it has to do with them being part of the nightshade family. So thankfully, Ben is someone who reads scientific papers. I found a scientific paper about Jamaica in the 1750s, and it writes about tomatoes. Incredible. It says often used in soups and sauces. So Ben Franklin, he's gonna be somebody who's willing to experiment. Other people, maybe not so much, but Ben, he'll try out a tomato. In modern America, a great hamburger needs a great sauce. Now, there's nothing like ketchup in the 18th century, but they certainly have mustard. I want to make an incredible 18th century mustard that will set this hamburger off. Vinegar sauces in the time period are really simple. We take our mustard seeds and we grind them up with a little bit of vinegar. Sometimes they use just water, but I can't imagine that. I don't know what that would taste like. We're using something just a little bit different here, and that is we're grinding it with mushroom ketchup. Mushroom ketchup has that tangy base vinegar flavor to it, and I think it's going to make a really, really good mustard sauce for our burger. Oh, I want to see the look on his face when he tastes this. This patty looks really good, but I'm worried about how it's going to cook. It's got different components in it, and it's really, really thick. I'm worried we came all this way. I don't want to mess this up and not have something good for Ben. For our toppings, we've got cheese. We've got a white cheddar. It's really good. We've got tomato. We've got onion. We've got lettuce and a little bit of that mustard sauce. Oh, I hope Ben loves this. I can't wait till he tries these flavors. This cheeseburger looks amazing. It smells great. I'm really excited to try it. I think Ben is going to love it. Now, I said we had something special coming up to add on to this, so here they are, curly fries. Yes, curly fries from the Virginia Housewife Cookbook in the early 19th century. This ought to set it off perfectly for Ben. Really good, crazy good. This patty was complicated, but the flavors in it work really well. They blend together and make it incredibly good. And I was really worried about that mustard sauce. It is perfect on this burger. You and I, we did it. We created an unbelievable burger using only the ingredients available in the 18th century. I love it. You're gonna love it. Ben's gonna love it.
This is my favorite time of year. I love autumn. I wish that I lived in the part of the country where we had a longer fall season because it's just fantastic. Right now, around here, most of the farmers have their crops in. Harvest has been good. We've different churches and groups around are having their harvest meals, and it's just cozy, it's warm. And this time of year makes me think of a few different dishes, a few different ingredients, obviously turkey and pumpkins and yams. Now this dish stood out to me because you don't oftentimes see, or I don't oftentimes see yams with fruit. And so this strange pudding just jumped off the page and I'm really, really excited to do it for today. Today's recipe is from Amelia Simmons' 1796 cookbook, American Cookery. It's a fantastic cookbook. We use it a lot on the channel and is considered the first American cookbook. It's got a fantastic name for the recipe, a crookneck, or a winter squash pudding. Core, boil, and skin a good squash, and bruise it well. Take 6 large apples, pared, cored, and stewed tender. Mix together. Add 6 or 7 spoonfuls of dry bread or biscuit, rendered fine as meal. Half pint of milk or cream, 2 spoons of rose water, some wine, 5 or 6 eggs beaten and strained, nutmeg, salt and sugar to your taste, 1 spoonful flour. Beat all firmly together and bake. The above is a good recipe for pumpkins, potatoes, or yams, adding more moistening or milk and rose water, and to the latter a few black or Lisbon currants or dried whortleberries scattered in will make it better. We're going to use yams in this recipe instead of a pumpkin or a squash just because while they're available at this time of year, I know that most people's Thanksgiving tables want to see yams. And this is a really great recipe that could make it to your Thanksgiving table. I think that it would be something interesting that people hadn't seen before, and you could have a lot of fun making this. So let's get going. First thing we have to do, there's a little bit of prep work before we can just start mixing things together and throw it in the oven. First, we have to take our yams that are raw and hard, and we have to do something to soften them. And I've already done that to these yams. Now, there are 2 options that you really have, or you can bake them or you can boil them. I chose to bake them. I like the caramelization that happens when you bake yams. I think that that's going to be really nice in this dish. So just throw them on a cookie sheet and throw them in the oven. Forget about them for an hour and they're going to be ready to go. It doesn't really matter the temperature. I think I cooked mine at 325. And they're nice and soft. We're going to be able to cut the skins and just spoon out the sweet potatoes so we can mix it all up. Now, I didn't prepare the apples yet. We need to do that right now. I pared the apples, cored them, got them chopped up small so I could boil them and soften them up a little bit. We got it here in the bowl with the soft sweet potatoes and mashed it all up. Now it's time to add the other ingredients. We've got some dry and wet ingredients. I'm going to go ahead and add the breadcrumbs real quick. So as you can see, I only have 3 eggs for this recipe. So we're basically cutting this recipe in half. I did about a cup of breadcrumbs and everything else is cut just about in half. I did make this recipe one other time And so I got a good feel about how wet that I want it to be. So after we get some of the dry ingredients going and start adding liquid, she even mentions maybe you want it to be more moist. We'll judge that by eye later on. All right, so I've got the breadcrumbs and the eggs in there. From here, we're gonna add our cup of cream. Nice heavy cream. And then it does call for a little bit of wine. I've got about a tablespoon of wine here. You can add more or less. I'm not gonna put rose water in here. I know it says to put rose water, but I can't stand rose water, so I'll probably end up adding a little bit more wine for that extra liquid. There's some flour, about a tablespoon as well, and then I've got about a 1/4 cup of sugar here. We're gonna get this all mixed in together, and once we do that, we'll add our whortleberries. Whortleberries, it's a very difficult word for me to say, are just dried blueberries. I think some people probably know that, a lot of people probably don't, but that's all it is, dried blueberries, and they're easy to find at the grocery store. You could use currants in this if you wanted to. You could probably get away with using raisins, but it's just another way to get these little flavor pops every once in a while. It's gonna be really nice. We've got our pot filled up, it's ready to bake, and as you can see, there's about, I don't know, there's a couple inches of space at the top because this is gonna wanna swell up and then it's gonna shrink back down eventually, but you wanna get some room. And also, I'm gonna take the lid and just put it off to the side because this is gonna bake uncovered. About an hour and a half, maybe hour and 15 minutes at 325 degrees. It'll turn out perfect. All right, here you are, John. It's finished.
Look at that. You know, I can't even remember when we did this episode.
That was a long time ago.
Was it, like 6, 7 years ago or something?
Yeah, it had to have been. Yeah. And that was part of the Thanksgiving feast thing.
Right.
So you guys held them all back and then tasted them all at once at the end together. Mm-hmm. So anyway, yeah, let's try it.
Okay.
I'm gonna make sure I get a currant in there, excuse me, a whortleberry.
A whortleberry. Oh yeah,
that's good.
Man, it's really good. Let's see. So it's sweet potatoes and apple mixed together, and then we have the special sweetener in there, which is, you know, the whortleberries.
The whortleberries. And there's some nutmeg. I was judicious.
I should have brought this grater just in case it needed more, but I think it's okay. This would make a tremendous addition to anyone's Thanksgiving. I can see why it was in the series, and that means it's in the Amelia Simmons cookbook, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, I was encouraging folks earlier. This can make it to your Thanksgiving table. I think it's really delicious. It will be different than anything else too. I mean, it's filling, but it's sweet. You know, it's not too sweet that it feels like a dessert. This is good. The apples come through.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I didn't know. It's like, oh, it's sweet potato and apple. Maybe it'll taste like one big sweet mixture, but no.
This has got a familiar taste to me, but I can't identify it as a modern dish necessarily. I mean, it doesn't say sweet potato to me right off the top, so. It's got a great a great flavor that if you just dished it out to somebody, they go, "What is that?"
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I think that the familiarity, it tastes like other period dishes that we make. The carrot pudding was really similar to this, and there are plenty of custard-like puddings, things.
Exactly.
But nothing modern. This is really good.
Wonderful. Great job.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, thank you for coming and tasting this with me. Nobody wants to eat a Thanksgiving dish alone.
Anytime.
So appreciate that. And you folks out there, thank you for watching. Have a very happy Thanksgiving get together with your family. I hope that it's a great day for you.
Happy Thanksgiving. When I get up in the morning, the world just isn't right. And I need my morning cup. And I gather my equipment together and my ingredients, and I start the water boiling. And soon I have this wonderful aroma. And that first sip sets the world straight. Now I can begin my day. For the last 20 years, I've been trying to understand and sometimes even live 18th century life. And one of the things I've been missing is coffee. And coffee, it isn't just a drink. It's something that impacts all of society in the 17th and 18th century. It's that important. You can't leave it out. It was so impactful that it created a location that was new to society, and that's the coffee house. You would be able to use it as a workplace. You might buy books at your coffee house. You might hear speeches, and it was a place of a lot of political discourse. So much so that various governments at different times tried to suppress coffee to keep that from happening. It was a very impactful part of your community. 18th century coffee houses aren't completely different than coffee houses today. But what about the coffee itself? Where does it come from? How was it prepared? And how was it roasted?
My name is Ryan Kerr, and I just bought a coffee company. Having worked at Townsends for the past 10 years, naturally taking my modern love for coffee and tracing its roots back to where it began in history is something that's super important to me. Modern coffee roasting is high-tech. Oftentimes it's using computer programs, you're measuring curves, lots of tools at your disposal. It's something that I've been apprenticing in for a while, and there's still a lot to learn. But what I want to get back to are the roots of roasting coffee. A single person roasting over an open fire for the needs for themselves and their household. I want to experience that. Whether we're talking about then or now, all coffee starts out as a coffee seed. And these come out of cherries from a coffee plant, and they're green. In the time period they were roasting dark coffee, there's even a reference of waiting until the coffee to sweat, and that's how you know that it's finished. And that's the oils coming out of the coffee bean after it's been roasted. Modern coffee is full of options, especially from where the coffee is coming from. Most consumers, when they walk into a coffee house, they know whether or not they want a coffee from Africa or if they want a coffee from Central America or something in between, because they understand those taste profiles. That is not how coffee was in our time period. In the time period, you had very few options. Most coffee was all roasted the same. You were happy to have whatever coffee you got, and as far as you were concerned, it all tasted the same. Today, two of the most popular regions to get coffee from are from South America and Central America. In our time period, you really didn't see much coming from that part of the world. It was happening mostly over in Africa. There's a lot of coffee coming from Arabian nations. You see a little bit coming from Jamaica and Costa Rica. Other than that, it's African based and is Middle Eastern.
Coffee roasting technique in the 17th and 18th century is bewilderingly simple. They used very, very crude equipment. Frying pans, or they might use a large ladle with little holes drilled in it. Sometimes they had these primitive rotary roasters, a metal round tin can on a long stick that you would turn on a spit in front of your fire. It's just hard to imagine that they could turn out drinkable coffee with such simple equipment. It's funny that modern roasting equipment is really just a variation on that round tin can on a stick. They have a large drum that's motor driven and it has a precision heat source, but down deep, it's exactly the same method. So I need to be honest with you. I am not a coffee drinker. I do not drink coffee. I drink tea every day. And that's one of the problems I've got with coffee. As I research it and understand it, that's all fine and good. But to truly understand it in its 18th century context, I need to roast it, I need to make it, I need to drink it and enjoy it.
This turned out really, really great. You see some darkness, and then there are some lighter beans. This is generally darker than what we would probably roast in trending coffee houses today. The trend has gone towards lighter coffee, but in the time period, they like dark coffee. Preparation for this coffee to drink it is super simple. In the time period, they didn't have a whole lot of options like we do now. And today we can say, oh, I want an AeroPress, or I want an espresso, or all these different kinds of coffee preps. In the time period, it was boiled water, either over ground coffee or cooked with ground coffee. That's it. You would boil the water, you would take it out, and then you would pour the grounds in and pour the water back over it, sort of like what is happening with a French press nowadays. The strength of coffee when it was brewed in the time period varied a lot. We've seen references from 1 single ounce of coffee in a quart of water, all the way up to 3 ounces of coffee in a quart of water, which is very strong. I know a lot of folks that like good, strong coffee, but I don't think that in current day I've ever heard of anybody drinking it quite that strong. That's very, very strong coffee. As far as additives to brewed coffee in the time period, you're seeing lots of things. Some folks are using sugar. They weren't at first, and then they move into that. You'll see milk come in a little later. Also, herbs, there's a reference to adding 2 cloves to a pint of coffee. Today, what I want to do is just drink this black, because I want to taste every bit of that smoke and everything that we roasted over the open fire.
From 1700 to 1800, the price of coffee changes immensely in America. At 1700, a pound of green unroasted coffee beans is selling for as much as 20 shillings. By 1750, that same pound is now only costing 5 shillings. And by 1800, it's down to a single shilling per pound. That is a big change, especially for the common man. What once was totally out of reach economically becomes something that they can afford every day.
Wow, that's way better than I thought it would be. At this point, I roast coffee almost every day. And there's something really special about taking something that is green and it's hard like pea gravel and you can't use it for anything, and within minutes it turns into something like this. It's doing it over the open fire is just, it made everything come together for me.
While I don't drink modern coffee, this is good. By the time you roast it, you've seen those green beans and you've roasted it, and you watch that transference from one thing to another, and then you grind it in that little grinder and it just makes powder. It's just nothing like modern coffee. And it does give me an appreciation for the effect it had in society. I think it is something really special. I'm really enjoying this.
This is a posset. If you look up posset today, this is something that you will find. This is a lemon posset. It is delicate and creamy. It's science. And it's absolutely delicious. You make this by taking cream, mixing it with sugar, reducing that, and it has to be just right. You have to have the right amount of sugar to the right amount of cream. Then you're gonna add lemon zest and lemon juice. And between the reduction and the lemon juice activating in that cream and curdling it, after it rests, you get something like this, where when you run your spoon through it, it leaves a trail. And it's almost like a custard, but not quite. And it's not quite a mousse. It's something all together on its own. It is fancy. You feel good when you eat it. It's something that you can make for a dinner party at your house or go to a high-end restaurant and see it on the menu. But this is not where posset started. In fact, you couldn't get further away from where posset first started. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking into today. What did a posset look like in the 18th century? By the time we get to the posset in the 18th century, it's already likely changed quite a bit from when we first see it referenced, and folks can find references to even the 16th and 17th century of what a posset is. Shakespeare used a posset in one of his plays. It's documented quite a ways back. Originally, when you see a posset, most of the time it's in the context of someone being sick. And so maybe you can think about this as a sort of chicken noodle soup or let's get well kind of dish or beverage. And that's something else that's really funny about it too, is that sometimes a posset seems like it's like a custard, or it's cream or milk mixed with bread. So other times it's referenced almost like it's a beverage or something in between, like a syllabub, which we've done on the channel before. So it's kind of strange researching it back. Now, I don't know a whole lot about posset before the 18th century, but I did find a really interesting recipe for it in the 18th century. Today's posset recipe comes from William Ellis's The Country Housewife's Family Companion. It was published in 1750, and it is a fantastic cookbook. We use it a ton on the channel because it deals with a lot of different types of food, and it has a focus on the working class and actually farmers. And so sometimes Ellis will actually say, hey, this is a good farmer's recipe for this time of the year, even in this activity, which really just is really interesting because you get to focus on exactly when he wants you to eat it. Now, this is probably going to be fun for the comment section here. This is to make a harvest posset the Hertfordshire way. Now, is it Hertfordshire, Hertfordshire? I'm not from there. I don't know. You guys know, and you're going to correct me. Let's just have fun with it, okay? Tell me how to say this so I say it right in the future. This is very commonly done for supper, but seldom for breakfast, because for the latter we send into the field either broth made from yesterday's meat crumbed with bread, or milk porridge with bread. But for supper, we often give the harvestmen a posset crumbed with bread, made in this plain manner. The maidservant boils new milk, and when it is so done, she puts about a pint of it into each man's wooden dish and immediately adds a quarter of a pint of stale strong beer, some coarse sugar, and crumbled bread, which turns the milk into a posset and gives the men a palatable supper. But if our country housewife has a mind to make a better posset, she may take a quart of new milk and mix it with a pint of ale, the yolks of 8 eggs, and the whites of 4, which when beaten must be put in the milk and the ale. Then add some sugar and nutmeg and stir it all the while it is on the fire until it is thick, but it must not boil, and it's done for eating. But if you will have the posset be richer, use cream instead of milk. Now, these are widely different dishes. One of them's got eggs, and one of them can even use cream to make it richer. It's got nutmeg as an extra spice. And I don't think that the other one is meant to be served with breadcrumbs because it didn't mention it in that one. But we're going to experiment with the first one today. This is for hungry workers. This is a simple food. This is for the working class. Let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about what this dish is doing. They're not going to be wasting resources. This is not something special, okay? This is nothing like what our posset of today is. This is to fill people up and give them enough energy to get the workday done. And then they said that they don't do this at the beginning of the day, probably because it's so heavy with the milk and the cream. They send at the beginning of the day, they send folks out with meat broth and bread. So this is going to be a little heavier. It's going to sit in your stomach and be nice for you to go to sleep with. The bread doesn't matter. whatever bread you have at home. The staler, the better. That's going to be what people are going to be using in this. And, you know, it's just sugar to taste, but the bread, it's not going to give you really any great flavor. We're talking about getting something to stick to your ribs. So you come in from a hard day's work and you feel like, oh man, I'm full, I'm satisfied, now I can go to sleep and get started the next day. That's all this is. This is simply fuel. That's all it's for. It's an interesting distinction, I think, between the two different recipes. The nicer one says, heat your milk up, let it thicken, but be careful not to boil it. The first one says to boil your milk. And I think that just shows how little care is going into this particular dish. If you want to make it nicer, sky's the limit. You can make this really nice. And there are a lot of sack and wine possets out there. I'm not saying that a posset couldn't be fancier, couldn't be nice. It very well could be. But this one, this is bare bones. We're going to get our milk in a pan, get it over the fire, get it heated up. As you can see, these don't look similar at all, and it makes you wonder. Okay, what is holding this to still being a posset, right? I don't know if it's something about consistency. It said in the recipe, when you add the bread to the milk, that will make it a posset. So are we talking about just something that's kind of thick but not super thick? This is almost like a hot cereal or a porridge kind of thing going on, which I guess you can get to custard from there. And this is kind of like a custard. Maybe they're not meant to be anything like one another anymore. I'm not sure. I just think it's a really interesting question to ask. And one of my favorite things about cooking on this channel is that we get to ask those questions. We get to say, this is something that I like now. What did it used to look like? Or sometimes it's vice versa, like this one. I wasn't really sure about what a posset was in the modern age. I found posset a few times in old cookbooks. I thought that's interesting. I went to research it and I found what a new posset is. So sometimes you chase it backwards, but it's really fun to draw those connections between modern food, historic food. Are they still at all the same? Have they deviated completely? And I think in this one, it seems like it has. Let's give it a try. Certainly is not appetizing when you look at it. That's really, really interesting. So this dark beer, notice what they called for, or a strong ale, really is bitter, which I don't mind because it's warm. It kind of makes it feel like you got coffee in a cereal, which is fine, I guess. Not something I've never poured a bowl of cereal and thought, I'm going to put coffee in this. But it's not bad. A little bit more sugar brought it all together. Now, I like that a lot. If I'm being completely honest with you, I don't think that this is something that I'll ever sit at home and say, I'm going to make this and eat it. But it is super interesting to see. This was dinner for somebody who'd been working in the field all day. This is what they came back to. And were they excited about it? I don't know. But it did the trick. And I don't think that anybody that we know in our modern day neighborhoods in America think this is what I want when I come home from working at harvest, when it's cold and it's just like backbreaking labor. They're going to come home and have some hot cereal or porridge kind of thing. I don't see it. This is where we find out the differences between then and now. This is where we find out societally what's going on, what people are accepting of. You know, oftentimes now you'll see a dinner table and it's got, you know, maybe a protein and a few sides or something. That's what people think of as a dinner. Or if it's a single dish, kind of casserole or pasta dish, it's complex. It's got lots of layers and stuff. This is some hot milk with beer and bread and a little bit of sugar. And it's fine. It's actually good. But it's not what I would imagine a working man would want to finish his day off with. And that is what's fun about digging into these cookbooks.
Tell me what you would do if tomorrow refrigeration disappeared. How would you preserve your food? How would the market preserve their food? You'd have to shop every single day. That is what happens when you take away salt in early America. Today, most of us think of salt as something that adds flavor to our food, that adds savor. But in early America, that aspect of salt is probably the least important part. Salting was the main food preservation technique of this time period. They're using it industrially with huge quantities of salt fish, salt pork, and salt beef. But not only in this huge setting, but it's also used in every household. They're salting meat, but they're also salting vegetables. Without salt food preservation, certain things are just not possible in our time period. You cannot travel overseas unless you have salt provisions. You really can't do a military campaign without salt provisions. And you can't even live through the winter without some kind of food preservation, and salting was the main one. Salt was so important that the first patent that was issued in North America in 1641 was for the process of making salt. If salt is that important, where does it come from? There are methods of getting salt all over the world, but there are certain places where salt is much easier to get that were commercial sources, especially in the 17th and 18th century. Spain, France, and Portugal were a very, very important salt center. They were right there on the coast where they could let salt flow into these shallow pans and pools. They would let it evaporate and they would collect the crystals there. And that salt was called bay salt. It was not a great quality of salt, but they had a great quantity. There's also a lot of salt coming from the West Indies in this time period. So Barbados and the Turks Islands and some other places in the Caribbean. They also had certain kinds of pools that would collect salt crystals, and they would be able to gather this up and fill up shiploads of salt. Salt is also coming from places like Germany, where they would take sea salt and they would boil it down to create the salt crystals. And of course, there are salt mines from more like Central Europe and some places in England. They would be able to mine salt in its rock salt form. And they had huge caves, and still do have huge caves where they will mine salt like it was stone. In the early 17th century, when colonies were being formed in North America, there was a big problem. Food was meant to be a major export from North America, especially fish from New England. The Plymouth Company sent over fishermen, they sent over boat builders, they even sent over a salt farmer, or someone to harvest salt. He was a failure. He created salt ponds, but they weren't made in the right spot. He created a big salt warehouse, but then he burnt it down. They gave up on really harvesting their own salt, and they relied on imported salt. You can't send off or export your fish without lots of salt. During the 17th century, other small salt harvesting operations start to pop up and down the East Coast. They were somewhat successful, but they could never truly supply what was needed in the colonies. This local salt lacked both quality and quantity, so inevitably the colonies turned more and more to outside sources. For 150 years, the demand continued to increase, but the salt continued to pour in. There wasn't a problem. Not until we get to 1776. Now we have a problem. The British see that there's a great demand for salt, and that is something they can attack. The British immediately start to destroy salt-making operations in North America, and they blockade salt for the colonies. They know that if they can cut off the salt supply, the Americans will not be able to continue to rebel. They will have to give up. The British are blockading the east coast of the United States. They're sending their ships up and down, and specifically to areas where they know that the colonial ships would have to congregate and go around different specific regions. And they took many and many a salt ship that was headed to the colonies. Salt became more important than getting arms, ammunition, uniforms, even other kinds of food. That was the item that they needed most to wage war. You can't send out ships into the ocean to fight a war unless you have salt provision. You can't send your armies out to march for a week without salt provisions. You've got to have salt. It was so important that they made plans to take their military ships out of service, to load them up with tobacco and flour, to send them out to trade for salt. The military knew that it was so important that they were willing to take their ships out of service to go get salt. I am happy to have it in my power to inform your lordship that by depriving the rebels of every supply of salt, rum, or sugar in my power, the first, as I observed to your lordship before, is raised from 1 shilling per bushel to 15. As we get into 1777, the price of salt skyrockets, and the merchants in the colonies see a great opportunity. They start to send messages to their agents in the West Indies. They say, do whatever you can do to charter or purchase ships, fill them with salt, and send them up to the colonies. They didn't care whether half of the ships or even 2/3 of the ships were taken. The ones that got through would pay for all the rest. It was that expensive. Joseph Plum Martin, in his memoir, gives us a wonderful example. In one situation, he finds a barrel of salt and he's so excited. It's very, very expensive. He fills his pockets with salt, as much as he can carry, because he knows it's that rare and that expensive. And he also runs into problems with not having enough food. And the reason why he doesn't have enough food is because they can't make enough salt provisions to supply the army. I was as near starved with hunger as ever I wished to be. I strolled into a large yard where there was several sawmills and a grist mill. I went into the latter thinking it probable that the dust made there was more palatable than that made in the former. But I found nothing there to satisfy my hunger. There was a barrel standing behind the door with some salt in it. Salt was as valuable as gold with the soldiers. I filled my pockets with it and went out. This salt shortage affects every person in the colonies, every family. If you don't have food preservation using salt, people are going to starve. People are going to go hungry. Because of the great demand and the high price, many people are looking for solutions. Things start to happen. The salt does get through the blockade, and more people do create salt. And after a year or two, the great salt crisis does seem to go away. Maybe the British kind of give up on blockading the salt. It really worked for a little bit, but then the whole system kind of came together and salt was available again. The price came down. So what do I learn from this salt crisis? 2 things. Number 1, the colonies were reliant on something that they did not have control over. That worked out for a long time, 150 years, and then it was a problem. They had to come up with all kinds of solutions. It worked out, and I think that's the other part of what I've learned from this specifically. Even though the system kind of broke, it didn't break entirely. And The great network that we have in the world, even in the 18th century, it came together and repaired itself. Those massive price increases in salt made it so that more salt came onto the market in different and new ways. And so the price of salt came back down. Everybody did have the salt they needed within a year or two. The system repaired itself. We live in times of crisis today. We've seen exactly the same kinds of problems. Studying this kind of history does give me comfort in seeing what resilient people have done in the past, how they have solved their problems. Maybe we can solve our problems the same way. I remember eating cup of soup for 2 years straight. And I've known people that survived their entire college career on nothing but cheap ramen noodles. It seems like everyone has to deal with financial hardship at some time in their life. And food is the first thing we cut from our budget. We find a way to survive on the cheapest, blandest food just to get by. This has been a problem throughout history, especially in the 18th century. People have to get by on the cheapest ingredients possible. Our goal is to take that monotonous meal that we have to eat over and over again and to turn it into something special. What we want is an empty pantry victory. The majority of people in Great Britain and a large quantity of people in North America during this 18th century time period were the working poor. They weren't necessarily beggars, but they had a very difficult time with paying for both their food and their lodging and their clothing. A typical working family in the 18th century is surviving on something like 5 shillings a week. That's a tiny budget. They're looking for the most affordable ingredients they can possibly find. I found a recipe that's perfect for this situation. It's in Primitive Cookery, and this was a compilation cookbook from the middle of the 18th century, and the author was concerned about feeding poor families. He even has a section in the back that talks about just the meal. It isn't about recipes per se, but a collection of 70 very, very inexpensive meals. This recipe is after that section. It's at the very end of the cookbook. It's almost like a P.S. Here's something that might really, really help. It's called, and probably the worst title for a recipe ever, Directions to Make Diverse Sorts of Herb Pottage. And herb pottage is really a soup, or almost like we can think of it as a thickened soup. When your water boils, put your herbs into it and let them remain 5 or 6 minutes. Then take your herbs out and put some little small oatmeal tempered with some cold water first. Beat it well with your liquor, add salt and butter to it, and eat with bread or without. So what is this really? The interpretation is a little difficult, but oatmeal is the main kind of component that is holding this together. It's sort of like an oatmeal soup with herb flavoring, and it is whatever herb you can get a hold of. And that's the key to this. How can we make the plainest oatmeal or oatmeal soup into something that's special, possibly extra nutritious, even medicinal at times? How can we take this super bland, you might call it gruel, and turn it into something hopefully good? It's not a coincidence that the foundation of this dish is oats. Gervase Markham in 1615, he has this book called The Well-Kept Kitchen. And he has an entire chapter on the excellence of oats. He talks about oats being important for animal food and for people food. And he ends up in the chapter with this final little bit. He says, "It is, oats, it is the very crown of the housewife's garland, and doth more grace her table and her knowledge than all grains whatsoever. Neither indeed can any family or household be well and thrifty maintained where this is either scant or wanting." The author is saying here, without oats in your pantry, you're not being properly thrifty. It would be like us not having rice or beans in our pantry. You know, we all grew up with rice and beans. I know I did. I'm sure you did too. The classic grain for comparison here is wheat. Wheat is a more expensive grain. It's harder to grow. You need just the right kind of weather. You need a nice, rich soil, and it's what makes wonderful bread. It's highly in demand. Oats, they grow in colder climates. They grow in weaker soil, and they're almost classified as an animal food. So it's cheaper. It doesn't look as good. You don't look like you're a well-to-do family, but you're surviving. You could buy oats prepared in various ways. The whole grain that you would use to feed to animals. Or you can grind it up into a flour, or not quite so far, grind it into a meal, or just sort of cracked oats, or today we would call them steel-cut groats. In this recipe, we'll be using steel-cut groats. I don't want to use oatmeal or oat flour because I want this to have some body, some tooth to it, instead of just a runny soup. Oats by themselves can be tremendously boring day after day. The very, very interesting part about this recipe is the diverse herbs that he talks about at the beginning. Herbs are really important here, and he means diverse in that it could be almost anything. Greens that we pick, we might have an herb garden, we might even wildcraft, go out into the wild and pick greens that show up in the common lands or in the wild areas. This is an income source for poor families. They can send children out into the fields to pick herbs and take those into the market. They're in demand. They're not going to make you a lot of money, but they can help a poor family survive. And in this case, they're surviving because they're going to be using these herbs to spice up the most boring dish ever. So they might pick dandelions, which a very nutritious thing, or stinging nettles. Something we would avoid today turns out to be very, very nutritious, very good for you. In Heckewelder's journal from the 18th century, he survives on nothing but stinging nettles for months. We have an assortment of herbs here that I've gathered, and some of them are dried, other ones are fresh from the market. And I want to put together a kind of springtime collection of flavors. I've got stinging nettles. Normally I would use fresh stinging nettles, but they aren't quite ready yet. In another 2 or 3 weeks, stinging nettles will be ready to pick. So I've got dried stinging nettles. We've got dandelions that seem to be ready to pick at any time of the year. We're going to take a little mint, a little dandelion, some of these stinging nettles, and maybe a little bit of sage. We're going to bundle these together, tie them up into a bundle, and throw them into our boiling water. The directions say for just 5 or 6 minutes. We're just infusing the flavor into our water, and then we'll put the oatmeal in after we take out the herbs. I want you to think of this bundle of herbs like the flavor packet in the ramen noodles. This is what takes the bland ingredient and spices it up. I haven't tried this out yet, but I picked this recipe specifically because it takes the most boring thing and tries to make it exciting. I hope it's good. Wonderful spring aroma. I believe this will be very, very flavorful. It's truly fascinating to dig back into history, see some of these extremely difficult situations, how people dealt with them, and realize that today we deal with things that are just as difficult. It's very comforting to know that in the past they got through these difficult times, and we can too. We've got a great springtime aroma, and what I'm hoping we've done is take the blandest breakfast that we might think of today and turn it into something savory, something completely different. And this definitely is different. It's got some incredible herbal flavors to it. And we could vary those up. We can change them up. This would be great for a savory lunch or a savory supper. This is so good. This is an empty pantry victory. You and I are on a mission. We've traveled back in time to meet a very important person. Let's call him Tom. He asks us, what do 21st century Americans enjoy eating? And we look at each other and we say, takeout lo mein. In 21st century America, you can find takeout lo mein in just about any small town or city in America, no problem. And lo mein is hit and miss. You can get amazing lo mein or not so good. So how can we make Tom the best lo mein possible with 18th century ingredients? Our time machine has landed us in 1793, and all we have are the clothes on our back. We have to make do with the ingredients that we can find here in the 18th century. At this point in American history, nobody has any idea what lo mein is. They're not even really familiar with noodles. They have a slight idea about pasta, but luckily Tom is a pasta fan, and he has also an interest in Chinese culture and philosophy, so he's the perfect person to bring this to. Some of this is going to be very easy. Our vegetables, cabbage, onion, and carrots. No problem. We need certain kinds of cuts of meat, which we can do. And then the real difficulty, both the noodles and what are we going to use for soy sauce? And of course, the cooking technique, totally different than early America. Let's start with the foundation. You can't have great lo mein without great noodles. Thankfully, Tom is familiar with pasta. He spent time in Europe as a diplomat. He loved macaroni. That was his thing. And so he even had made for him a macaroni machine. And we even have a document with a picture where he drew a macaroni machine, and this is how it was made. In fact, on the back of that, this is the best part, he gives us a pasta recipe so we know exactly what his noodles can be made like. His recipe goes like this: 6 eggs, yolks and whites, 2 wine glasses of milk, 2 pounds of flour, a little salt, then work them together without water very well and roll with a roller until it's paper thin. The title of Tom's recipe is For Macaroni. Of course, it's pasta. We can turn it into whatever shape we please. It'll make perfect lo mein noodles. To make it a lot easier, I'm cutting this into strips. Then, as I roll it out, I can get it to that paper thin thickness that he talks about in the recipe. Our next major struggle is going to be soy sauce. Can you even imagine lo mein without soy sauce? I mean, it is the marker for this dish. We have to have something that's just like that. Luckily, here in the late 18th century, we have an umami replacement for that, and that is mushroom ketchup. We might need to adjust it a little bit, but I think that will give us the flavor we really need for lo mein. We have another problem with this sauce. We need a thickener, something that will make it stick to those noodles. We can't use cornstarch, and we certainly can't use flour. Ugh, that would be terrible. So we have to find a replacement for that to make it really bind together. We're going to use honey because it'll give us that thickening agent as well as the sweetener. It starts off with a cup of chicken broth. Then we have our soy sauce substitute, which is our mushroom ketchup. Then we have the sweetener and the thickener to this. That's the honey in this case. We've got a little bit of pepper, a dash of oil in here, and then for our oyster sauce, I've got this super thickened mushroom ketchup. That's very powerful stuff, so I don't think we're gonna need much. We need to marinate for our meat. Very, very simple. We've got 5 components here, a little bit of wine, a little bit of oil, a little bit of salt, a little bit of sugar, and a little mushroom ketchup. We're just gonna put that on and get this meat marinated. We also have the difficulty of cooking technique as well as equipment. There's nothing like a wok here in late 18th century America. So we're gonna have to use a regular pan. I've got some ideas about how we can make this work, but this is not gonna be easy. And we've come all this way. I mean, I want this to be great for Tom. Today we're using the double brazier in the kitchen, and this is something that they would use many times in the kitchens of an 18th century setting. They would have a brazier where they would use charcoal for a clear, smokeless fire. Now, it is not safe to use this in a modern kitchen because it exhausts carbon monoxide, but we have an 18th century kitchen here. There's lots of ventilation and we're paying attention. Once our noodles are boiled enough, it's time to strain them and place a little bit of oil on them so they don't clump together. Next up, our vegetables. We're going to start cutting up our cabbage and our onion. We're going to cook these vegetables in a hot pan. You don't want them to burn, you want them to stay crispy, so only cook them about a minute. A little more oil goes in the pan, and now the marinated steak. We're gonna toss these in that pan and just let them cook. Don't stir them around. And then as soon as they are browned, that browning comes up around the outside of the meat, we can stir that until they are cooked all through. We're gonna put these with our cooked vegetables to wait for just a second. Now into this pan goes minced ginger. We only need about a teaspoonful. Just let this cook until it gives you that wonderful ginger aroma. Now we start to reintroduce our components. In go our noodles. We're gonna move them over to the side of our pan and introduce 1/4 cup of dry sherry. Now we can move the noodles back over, and on top of that goes the pre-cooked meat and vegetables. Incorporate this all together. Now we're gonna slide this over in the pan yet again, and then our pre-prepared main sauce goes into the side of the pan, not on top. We're gonna let this cook just a little bit, and we can watch it start to thicken up in the pan. As soon as that thickens up, now we're gonna stir this all together. Be gentle, don't break those noodles. Top this off with green onion, and then it's ready to come off and serve into our bowl. I love the way this looks and smells. I can't wait to try this out. I can just guess that that mushroom ketchup is going to be such a great substitute for soy sauce. And then that marinated meat, oh, it smells great. And the vegetables and the noodles, I really want to try out those noodles. And a special thanks, before I try this out, to Jason Farmer. Make sure to check out his channel. He helped us out a lot with getting this right. So let's give this a try. This is great. It fits all the flavor notes. I love it, and Tom's gonna love it too. Whenever I am reading through a cookbook and I see boil for 12 hours, I'm very, very intrigued. Today's recipe has exactly that. Boil for 12 hours. I was looking for an Indian pudding recipe because this is the time of year for classic New England Indian pudding. There are several different ways to make puddings in the 18th century, and sometimes they bake them, but many times they're boiled. And we've done multiple boiled pudding recipes on the channel. So sometimes we're gonna be boiling like a plum pudding or a hunter's pudding. Rich flour puddings with suet, and they're wonderful puddings. This one is boiled for probably 2 or 3, 4 times longer than a typical boiled pudding. And this isn't huge. Even a big boiled pudding in the 18th century might only get cooked 4 or 6 hours. This one calls for 12 hours. That's crazy. I've got a recipe here from 1798 for a 10-pound, and that's really big, a 10-pound boiled pudding, and it only gets boiled for 6 hours. Now you're saying Indian pudding, what's an Indian pudding? Indian pudding is called Indian pudding because it's made with Indian corn. In the 18th century, what we call corn was always called Indian corn because the word corn just means a grain. It could be any grain whatsoever. So if you said, give me a corn, it might be a corn of wheat, a corn of barley. And in this case, they used the word Indian corn to say, oh, this special grain that today we call corn, or you might even know it by maize, which kind of differentiates it more. So I wanted an Indian pudding, which is what they always called it until maybe about 1840, when it might be called corn pudding. Such a wonderful recipe and so easy that anybody can do it. The recipe today comes from Amelia Simmons's American Cookery, 1796. Very, very important cookbook for us understanding what cooking is like in North America in the 18th century. There is no other cookbook like it until 10 and 15 and 20 years later showing up in North America. So this is a sort of a Rosetta Stone cookbook that helps us understand the differences between English cookery from the 18th century, maybe even German cookery, where there are influences in here, and what happens when that food comes to North America. There are 3 Indian pudding recipes in this cookbook. We're going to be using number 3, and it goes: salt a pint of meal, wet with 1 quart of milk, sweeten, put into a strong cloth, a brass or bell metal vessel, stone or earthen pot, secure from wet, boil for 12 hours. So super simple recipe. All of the materials that we need for this recipe are salt, cornmeal, we need some milk, and we need a sweetener. That's it, like 4 ingredients. It's really, really simple. Now, she takes a lot of time. She says, we're gonna boil this, and then she gives us like 7 different ways to boil it. So we can boil it in a cloth. We can boil it in a brass pot of some sort. Not sure quite what she's intending here, or a stone or earthenware pot. Now today, we're going to be using an earthenware pot because as the directions go further, it says secure from wet. She doesn't want this to mix with the water that it's getting boiled in at all. And that's very, very difficult to do if you're boiling in a cloth. So many of the recipes are boiling in a cloth. I thought we would boil in the pot to try it in a slightly different way. This reminds me of something like a jugged hare recipe. There are some recipes where we do this, where we cook inside of a pot that's being boiled all the time. Why are we not baking this? Because some of the recipes are baked. Well, what happens if you don't have an oven? And she's dealing with people that are in all sorts of economic circumstances. Maybe you don't have an oven at home, and that is very true for many people. So something where we get to cook this by boiling it, well, everybody's got a pot to boil something in. We've got our dry ingredients already mixed up here, and now the important part here is the ratio of cornmeal to milk. We want 1 part cornmeal to 2 part milk by volume, and we've got our 1 part of cornmeal in here. I need 2 cupfuls, and this is like 2 cups here, 2 cupfuls of our milk, and we're going to add those to this. And it says sweeten to taste, or sweeten it as you please. Many of the recipes as we go into the 19th century further on use molasses. It's a very inexpensive sweetener of the time period. I'm going to use another quintessential sweetener of New England, and that is maple syrup. So sweeten to taste to me means it needs to be kind of sweet. On our maple syrup, I'm using about a cup in this recipe. Like several of the recipes in this cookbook, if you look at this, you say, this will never work. I know I did a pumpkin pie recipe out of the same cookbook, and it made this just totally liquid interior, and I'm thinking, this will never set up. It'll never turn into a pumpkin pie. It turned out perfect. So I'm gonna take her at her word and say, yes, this sloppy mess will make a wonderful Indian pudding. All we have to do now is transfer this into our cooking pot. One last step is to seal this pot up, because I could just put the lid on and then set this in our boiling pot of water, but it says to be really careful that it doesn't get wet inside. So I'm gonna do a couple of extra precautions. I've made this kind of a sealing dough to go in the top level of this. This is something that they would do for the mouths of ovens. If you want the door stopped up really tight to keep the steam in, which is exactly what we want here, you would make a real quick, inexpensive, just, you're not going to eat it. It's just to seal up the surface, a little bit of dough. So I just took a little bit of flour, tiny bit of salt in there, and some water, and we made this little dough mixture. Okay, there has got to be a mistake. It does not turn out like this. This is not Indian pudding. And it's basically uncooked down there. This thing cooked for 12 hours. So something's completely wrong with the way the recipe is or the way I read it. So let's dig in. Let's look at that recipe real quick. Sometimes I get a little overexcited and I get working on a recipe and I need to dig a little bit further. So I started digging on this and I found not just one problem, but two problems with this particular recipe. And all we really need to do is super dig in on these other ones. Now, because I have done one of these other recipes earlier and it worked out, I thought, it shouldn't be a problem, right? Number one, there are errors on the back side of on the back page of the cookbook. Errors where the author, she says, I didn't know how to lay out this cookbook, so I gave the project to somebody else and they purposely messed up some of my recipes. Anyway, it says here that for Indian pudding number 3, you only boil it 6 hours. Well, we know that overboiling it isn't the problem of this particular part because the bottom just isn't like cooked. So we know that's not the problem. So if we look at recipe number 1, it says, and it doesn't read perfectly, but it says, stir together while hot. Stir together the cornmeal and the milk while it's hot. Well, we didn't do that. It doesn't say that in number 3. And number 2 is even less easy to understand. 3 pints of scalded milk to 1 pint of salted meal, and then let it cool. Again, they're implying that it's hot. You stir those together hot, maybe even kind of cook them together a little bit. And we didn't do anything like that. So I think that's the real problem here, is that the cornmeal needs to be cooked and mixed with that hot milk so that it absorbs some of that moisture before we start to cook it into our pudding. So we're gonna have to try again. Our second try, out of the water bath, and we only cooked it 6 hours this time, so it looks much better. We opened this up, and obviously it stayed almost exactly the same way as it went in, which is probably good. So let's find out just what it ended up tasting like. Now, the one before, we couldn't even serve it like this. It was just so hard and dense, and it just didn't have any flavor to it at all, except for just raw cornmeal, basically. And this has a much nicer texture. Now this is pretty cold. It's been outside, so it's got a really, nice firm texture. Maybe if it was inside, have just a slight bit more flavor, but I don't think this is meant to be eaten hot. Although I think you could eat it hot without any problem, but usually I think they'll let this cool down to room temperature and just serve it up as a dessert. It's a pudding. And it's got a wonderful flavor. Sometimes they put fruit in this one. This recipe did not have any fruit, but you could almost kind of imply from sweeten to your taste that putting raisins in or currants or even cranberries were something that they might do in this recipe under the whole sort of category of sweeten. And this has that hint of maple flavor because we used maple syrup. It doesn't have a darker color. If we would have used molasses, it would have sort of a browner color, which sometimes you see with an Indian pudding. Well, this certainly has been a learning lesson in what we see as a recipe sometimes, just a couple lines, super simple, and in fact that makes it much more difficult to interpret and to understand unless we dig into the whole cookbook. In this particular circumstance, we had to pay attention to the errors on the back page, look at all the other recipes, and use them all combined together to understand what this particular recipe is. And if it's a historical recipe like this one, sometimes we even have to go outside of this particular cookbook and say, okay, well, what does it say in another cookbook? Because sometimes each recipe is missing something that the other one has, so that we can truly understand what this dish is supposed to be like. And it helps us if we know what the modern version is too. We can get an idea about was the earlier one completely different, or are we just not doing it right when we're looking at the historical recipe? I guess the real question is what we achieved with the second part of the cooking. So, we put the cornmeal in the warm milk, and it's started to thicken up. And because the way we prepared this, we kind of cooked it up just a little bit more so that it thickened, and then we put it in here. And tasting the mixture before we put it in here, and then after the 6-hour boil, what was the real big difference? I guess that's a question from your side. It's like, what was the real big difference? And it's really hard to say. With this particular dish that we did this particular time, it doesn't seem like there's a massive difference in the texture, but I do think it possibly took the edge off of some of the corn flavor that some people might not like, or maybe changed the texture so that it didn't have sort of hard bits in it. But it's tough to say that this one changed a whole lot. Was it worth boiling it for 6 hours? I'm just not sure. So I've made a much more successful Indian puddings in the past. This one has been a bit of an experiment on just how this particular version of the recipe worked out. And I think what's really missing here is the little sweet components and the change in texture that you get from raisins or currants or cranberries or even chunks of apples. Some of the recipes mention that. I think it's really missing in here. If I was going to change it, I'd definitely put something in like that. I think it would be much, much better. I love searching for buried treasure. And when I'm researching in history, that's what I'm looking for. Things that we've lost, things we've left behind, things that maybe we need to look at again or even bring back. Today's episode is about fried potatoes. So I've been researching all about potatoes and going different places, looking at different books. I think I found a hidden gem, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but fried potatoes are wonderful. They're a comfort food for me. I remember them as a child, eating fried potatoes all the time. They're something that we eat in our childhood because when we're a child, our parents probably aren't well-to-do and we're eating inexpensive foods. And those come back to us in adulthood. Those inexpensive meals are those comfort foods we remember as children, and they usually are something, inexpensive and simple. I love those recipes. I love looking for, fun, simple recipes, and they connect us with today. So fried potatoes, perfect kind of thing for that. Potatoes in our time period are fairly new. They haven't been around in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. They only start popping up in English cookery at about 1650 or so. By 1750, they become very popular. A lot of people are surviving almost on nothing but potatoes. And so potato recipes are just sort of popping up everywhere in 18th century cookbooks. And a lot of them contain a very simple fried potato recipe. Hannah Glass's is the classic of this time period, and it is basically exactly like probably what you're used to fried potatoes being. You take raw potatoes, you slice them up thin, and you fry them up in a pan with a little bit of oil or maybe butter. Of course, they wouldn't do what we would do. I would just sprinkle, salt on them. They put sugar and sack wine on them. I don't know what those fried potatoes would taste like. And that's not what we're gonna make today. The intriguing recipe I found was from Primitive Cookery. Now, this recipe book is a collection of recipes that I found at other places. Most of them from cookbooks, but this particular recipe for fried potatoes comes out of the Modern Husbandman by William Ellis in 1744. This isn't a cookbook, it's a book on farming that includes a few recipes. This is very interesting in that the dish is not a side dish like we would expect our fried potatoes, but it seems to be a dish that is meant to be the entire meal. That got me going. That's the one I want to try. Let me read to you this recipe out of Primitive Cookery because it's word for word the same as the William Ellis recipe. To fry potatoes, when they are boiled and sliced, have yolks of eggs ready beaten up with a grated nutmeg or two. When the pan is hot, dip the slices in the yolks of eggs and put them in your pan. And when they are fried on both sides, pour over them butter, sugar, and rose water. Let me tell you what we're not going to do. We're not going to put rose water on our wonderful fried potatoes. But other than that, this recipe is very, very interesting, very good. I did not add these nutmegs. They're in here. I don't go back in time and add nutmegs to every recipe. I can't help it, even if I am the chairman of the International Nutmeg Fan Club. It's there. It's right there. This recipe sounds like a brand new comfort food to me. I can't wait to try them out. The first step is boiling the potatoes. Now you're gonna say, fried potatoes, why are we boiling the potatoes first? Well, if we don't boil these first, then when we put that egg coating on the outside, that'll cook, it'll overcook, and the potato will still be raw. So that's why we have to boil these first. Small farming is a fascinating topic in the 18th century and what's happening in Great Britain. We dig into William Ellis's books, and he's got multiple ones, and he touches on this small farmer over and over again. The resources that he needs, the kind of help he needs, and how he deals with the crops and the animals and the household altogether. He's writing books for this entire system. So maybe you're not a big fan of nutmeg and you want to try some other spices. Think about what you would use in French toast. Maybe cinnamon. It's a good place to experiment. The buried treasure I found wasn't just this recipe, but this wonderful letter. It was a letter written in 1797 by a farmer, and he explains his situation. Now, 1797 is important. That's a time in Great Britain when there's a crop failure with wheat and bread is very, very expensive, and it's causing bread riots. And this farmer writes a letter to the editor, and he says, "My family does not even eat bread, And he goes on to explain. He says, I have a small farm, not a rich farm, and my family is 23 people. And he probably means an extended family. He might even include some farm workers in his family. He says, we survive on potatoes as our bread. We grow potatoes on 4 acres of land. As soon as they're ready to harvest, right after Michaelmas, we dig pits in the ground and we store our potatoes in the pits. We put straw on top of them, horse manure on top of that, and then we pack sod on that. And the potatoes are good year around. So he has potatoes whenever he needs them. And they use potatoes for every single meal. They might boil them, they might fry them. They have potatoes for everything. Maybe some meals are just potatoes, other times it goes with another kind of dish. But the hidden treasure for me was this concept of this entire family unit, these 23 people and this small farm. This was like a small factory. In this situation, if you were sick, there was help. If you needed extra people for harvest, there were people available. It was very resilient and self-sufficient. That's one of the things we have left behind. We don't have those kinds of units of family left anymore. Not a large situation like that that's self-reliant. I'm not saying that we'll ever be able to get back to anything like that. We've progressed from that, but there are concepts there that we need to address in our modern lives. Are there situations and are there communities around us that we can connect into to get back to something like that? Those are the hidden gems I love finding in 18th century life that we just can't even fathom today. Let's think about the family in the letter. They've grown their potatoes, eggs from their chickens. They've made an entire meal. It's time to try this one out. I've decided that we're going to try out some with salt and pepper, and then just like the recipe calls for, some with sugar. So we'll see what these taste like. Let's try the salt and pepper first. Good. It's good. The potatoes definitely have a different texture than what you're used to. You know, they are nice and soft, but still hold together. You don't want to boil those so long that your potatoes kind of fall apart. The real question is, what about the sweet ones? Are they like French toast? Okay, that's weird. I don't know if I like that or not. Hold on. Let's stick with salt and pepper. The sugar one was weird. Now, I'm not ready for that. The salt and pepper one definitely reminds me of hash browns. Probably a little easier to make than hash browns, and it gives you that same kind of flavor and that wonderful comfort food feel. Christmas is one of my family's favorite times of year. It's a wonderful holiday, you know, lots of decorations, special food, special traditions. And I so want that to be true for colonial America in the 18th century. You know, 1775, and what are they doing for Christmas? And we can kind of envision this. We can put our Christmas and kind of plug it into colonial America and think it's wonderful, but it's just not there. You know, you do the research and Christmas is something completely different. Not anything like what we would expect for colonial Christmas. We can't just take our Christmas and plug it in to 250 years ago because it doesn't work. Here are the books that tell us some about what Christmas is like in colonial America. First, Thomas Turner's diary. He's not in America, he's in Sussex, England. And he writes about Christmas, and yeah, they go and they visit people on Christmas. It's more about visiting. It's, you know, not necessarily special food, but it's going around and maybe parties, right? In fact, about February 7th, in one of the years, he says, "Whew, Christmas season's finally over. We can stop visiting people," because he's talking about being an introvert, not wanting to go do all that visiting. Matthew Patton's diary. He's in New Hampshire, and he's writing in the middle of the century from 1754 to 1788. And so in New England, he is very particular. This is his daybook diary about what he does for business. And, we can go to a typical December 25th. And let's see, December 25th, I attended at Colonel Joff's on a case. I sued Ebenezer Farley, but he did not appear. He was in court. They had court on December 25th. That's just, we wouldn't connect that at all. It's other days on December 25th, he's making parts for shoes, or, he's taking grain to the mill. That's not Christmas, right? We can get a lot of ideas, but sometimes we need to find somebody who's really going to explain it to us. So, Peter Kalm, he's from Sweden. He comes to America, and he's going to explain things back to people in Sweden. Well, he's really helpful because he can explain stuff to us 250 years later. So let me see if I can find the page here. He writes about Christmas two different places. He writes this on January 5th. He says, Christmas Day was celebrated today, January 5th, by the Swedes and the English, for they still use the old calendar. So there's a calendar thing going on in the middle of the 18th century. There's like a 10-day shift. Anyway, members of the English church hardly make any bigger preparations for Christmas than for any Sunday. When it came on a weekday, it was not celebrated any more than the Swedish Apostles' Day. The Quakers paid still less attention to it, for since they observe no other holiday except Sunday, they work on Christmas Day just as on any other day unless it comes on a Sunday. He writes about it in one more place, and here he says, there was no baking of bread for the Christmas festival, no Christmas porridge on Christmas Eve. Christmas porridge. I love that idea. One did not seem to know what it meant to wish another one Merry Christmas. However, I have heard several members of the English church wish one another a happy Christmas holiday. There we go. A couple of quick ideas about what's going on with Christmas. One of these other books said, well, Christmas is hardly ever really celebrated by any other than the Dutch. So we know that the Dutch are the immigrants, Dutch immigrants are the ones that are the most likely to celebrate Christmas. Well, thankfully, we do have someone who helps us a little bit and gives us some Christmas tradition. This is Amelia Simmons's American Cookery Cookbook. It's done right at the end of the 18th century, 1796. She's from that New York area. It does have a Dutch influence in the cooking, and she gives us a recipe for another Christmas cookie. So, we do have something for Christmas. We can finally make something that gives us an idea for colonial Christmas. So let's make another Christmas cookie. So this recipe is really important. This cookbook is really important for several different reasons. But this one's titled Another Christmas Cookie. It's funny because it doesn't say, like the one above it doesn't say Christmas cookies. It says cookies. And then it says another Christmas cookies. Like, well, Christmas is the only time you make cookies. I guess, maybe, it's hard to say. She doesn't explain that completely. Another really important thing here is this is the first cookbook that I know of, English cookbook, that shows up with chemical leavening. Something that makes your cookies light and fluffy with a chemical instead of using yeast, or maybe, you might leaven it with something like eggs that you whip up. But nope, this uses chemical leavening, and that's definitely a Dutch tradition that does not show up in English cookbooks in the 18th century at all, ever. So here we've got that. Let's read the recipe for another Christmas cookie. 2-3 pounds of flour. So add 2-3 pounds of flour. Sprinkle a teacup of fine powdered coriander seed. Rub in 1 pound of butter and 1.5 pounds of sugar. Dissolve 3 teaspoonfuls of pearl ash. That's our chemical leavening. Pearl ash in a teacup of milk. Knead all it well together. Roll 3/4 of an inch thick. That's massive. We're not going to do it that thick. And cut or stamp into shape or size you please. So there's this idea of decorating. Bake slowly 15 or 20 minutes. Though hard and dry at first, the cookies, if you put in an earthen pot and a dry cellar or a damp room, they will be finer and softer and better when 6 months old. Can you imagine? You're gonna like July 25th, you're gonna be making Christmas cookies and then you're gonna put them down in your basement so they're soft in time for Christmas. I don't think we need to worry about that. I've gone ahead and we're gonna make a 1/3 recipe because this will make a bazillion cookies. You don't want this many, well, I would eat them all. But anyway, we're gonna make a 1/3 size recipe here. Let's start off with the chemical leavening part of this. You say, John, chemical leavening, I've never heard of it, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, anytime you're using baking soda or baking powder, that's chemical leavening. It's making a fizzy thing going on. And in our recipe, she uses pearl ash. That's an old primitive version. That's actually made from ashes from trees. You burn up a whole bunch of trees. We used to have, so many trees we didn't know what to do. So we'd burn them all down. We'd take the ashes and then we'd turn them into pearl ash, which turns out to be potassium carbonate. It's a very weak version of what turns out to be later on sodium bicarbonate. So she uses 3 teaspoons of pearl ash. We don't need nearly as much. This is a cut down recipe, but we need about half as much of baking soda, which is our closest equivalent to pearl ash. So I've got here a 1/2 teaspoon. It's not very much at all. 1/2 teaspoon, and we're going to dissolve that into 4 ounces of milk. Just regular whole milk will work fine. Next, we're gonna mix in these dry ingredients. I've got the butter and the sugar. They're kind of the easiest 2 things to get started with mixing. So I'm just gonna take a spoon here. I could soften this butter up a lot. I don't think I want it to be too softened. So you don't want it to be like super hard out of the refrigerator or you're gonna break your arm getting these mixed in. But let's get the sugar and butter creamed together. Again, we're making 1/3 of a recipe, so I have a 1/2 pound of sugar and 1/3 of a pound of butter. Now I'm gonna mix our coriander into the flour, and we have 1 pound of flour and 1/4 cup of coriander ground. You want to make sure that it's nice and fresh coriander. This is the only spice in here. It doesn't even have nutmeg. So you wanna make sure that coriander's got a bite to it. If you need to, get some coriander seed and actually grind it up. If you want some really fresh, kind of, you want all of that coriander flavor, right? So we've got our coriander. I mixed it in with the flour. Now we're just gonna drop it into our already creamed butter and sugar and get that all mixed up. We've got our dry ingredients and the butter all mixed nicely together. It's looking really good. I think that our baking soda is all dissolved, so it's ready to pour in. Our cookie dough is ready to roll out on the table. Let me clear off this table and we'll roll this out. Cut these into any decorative shape you like, just as Amelia Simmons directed. And these go into the oven. She calls for 15 to 20 minutes. With this kind of leavening, yeah, I would set your timer at 15 minutes and check them. You'll probably need to stay in there till 20 minutes. Bake it around 325 or so. It goes in a slow oven, as they say. So let's get these in the oven because I want to eat them. Okay, these are just out of the oven and they smell really, really good. I mean, I really want to try these. I'm gonna hold off for just a second though. I want to talk about the leavening. So I spent a lot of time talking about the leavening on these. I did do a few of these cookies earlier with the pearl ash leavening. Remember at the end, she talks about them being hard. Well, they are a good bit harder. They aren't nearly as fluffy. We might even, to get closer to the historical cookie, as it were, take that amount of leavening, the sodium bicarbonate, the baking soda, and half it again. Because here's one of the ones, there it is. It breaks open. It's not so hard you can't break it. But there's not very much fluffiness here. Here is the one that just came out of the oven, still warm. It breaks open, it's very soft, and there's a good bit more fluffiness, little air pockets in there. So I don't think these would get nearly as hard so that you have to put them in your basement for 6 months before you eat them. Definitely leavened more, they puff up a little bit more. You can tell these started out as squares and they pretty much end up as squares. These kind of grew a little bit in the oven. Isn't that interesting? Coriander is the only spice in here? I'm intrigued. No nutmeg, no cinnamon, no cloves, none of those things that we typically think of as Christmas. In fact, why does she think these are Christmas at all? Unless just the idea that a cookie goes with Christmas. I'll bet you that's the connection. The first one said cookie, and then another one said another Christmas cookie. Like, well, cookies, you make them at Christmas time. It's the only time you make them. Every day is Christmas for me. Coriander. Okay. Perfect cookie texture as far as I'm concerned. Wonderful flavor. I would never guess that a coriander cookie is going to taste like this, and it's really, really good. It's got the right amount of sweetness, not too sweet like some cookies can be today. I don't taste any of the leavening, which can be one of those things that can be, it's like, too much leavening and you get, doesn't taste good. These are perfect. I can exactly see why these would be Christmas cookies. And yeah, I want to eat every single one of them. It's great to be able to reach back into 18th century cookbooks and find something I can directly connect with Christmas. Thank you, Amelia Simmons. She did such a great job. And I can't wait to add these into my current Christmas tradition because I think they taste wonderful. We got a direct connect, and I'll be eating a lot of these in the future. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Merry Christmas. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire. We've all heard the song. We've probably all sang along with the song. The question is, have we ever tried roasted chestnuts? I certainly have not. Our special guest, Michael Dragoo, has brought in chestnuts for us, and we are going to try that out. Tell us about roasted chestnuts.
Sure. Chestnuts have been roasted for a long time. I had a hard time finding a dated recipe going back to this time, and I think it's just so obvious a thing to do that no one ever wrote them down. Like today they write down recipes that are kind of extravagant or hard. This is so simple and everybody was doing it. We had a blight that took out most of our American chestnuts. Today, were you to order chestnuts, you can still get American chestnuts. These are American chestnuts, but 80% of the chestnuts purchased in the world are from China. The other 20% are from Italy. You can get them from France and from other countries, but predominantly they are other chestnuts. They're related to lots of things. These little guys are one nut. There are some other chestnuts, I think the Chinese chestnuts, in that shell might be 2 or 3 nuts. What we're going to do is we're going to cut the shell so it expands, so it doesn't explode, and we're just going to roast them over an open fire. They're going to get softened, and we're going to enjoy their little innards.
Yeah, I think the reason why you wouldn't see them in a recipe book is because, I mean, it is the recipe, right? Roast the chestnuts. What is there? What recipe is there about it?
Yep.
Other than the simple direction of, cut the shell, which I
Right.
don't think anybody, since everybody was eating them, they probably seen the finished product, and so they
knew what to
wouldn't
do.
bother to write it down.
Right. You can buy chestnut roasters, pans with holes in their bottoms. I have a early 1800s copper chestnut roaster from England that's meant to steam the chestnuts, or it's a roaster, you could steam lots of things in it. But we're predominantly today, when I try to find original recipes, they're just in a pan, heating up over a fire. And that's what we're going to try.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire. In the song, it's called the Christmas song. Are these directly related to Christmas?
Only in that it's a late harvested produce, and they have a short shelf life once they're produced, so you consume them right away.
Right around Christmas
Yes,
time.
yes.
That's when they're ready.
Yep. To prepare these for roasting, I soaked these for about a half an hour. You can soak them up to 24 hours. You're doing 2 things. You're trying to soften the outer shell so it's easier to cut, but you're also trying to introduce water into the chestnut, because they're not just roasting on the open fire. It takes something besides that external heat, so you've got to be steaming from within. And now we're just cutting through the shells. There's an outer shell, and then there's a membrane inside, and we're trying to cut through both of them without slicing our thumbs off. This is an adult watching an older child project, not a young child project.
These little outer shells are tough. It's no wonder. If you don't slice them, what happens?
They explode.
Yeah, so you don't want to do that. So you definitely have to slice.
No, and
slice these
they explode with enough velocity that they can take out your oven light or perhaps
Okay.
crack your glass.
Okay.
They take
Make
off.
sure to slice your chestnuts. So this is surprising. It wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be.
We had 3 batches here. The first batch I didn't put in a cloth to steam once I pulled them out of the pan.
Right.
They were very difficult.
Yeah.
They resisted all attempts
Right.
to peel
So
nicely.
there's the outer husk. There's the inner kind of skin.
Yeah, it's a fibrous kind
And
of thing.
that inner skin, unless it's still moist and still warm, it just doesn't want to separate from
Right.
that inner sort of the nut
nut
proper.
itself, right.
And you don't want to eat that.
No,
The skin is not
it's
good.
bitter.
It's not good. So
And then the other 2 batches we steamed, and they peeled much easier.
Right.
It's important to cut not only through the outer shell, and it's difficult. I don't know how to do it right. I don't have any tools. I just used a paring knife. But you got to cut through that membrane too, because if you do, and if you cook them till they're soft, and then if you let them steam in a cloth, it all comes off together. And they peeled rather nicely.
But you still have to peel them when they're almost hot.
Yeah.
It's hot enough you,
Almost too hot to touch.
Right.
You're right on the hairy edge. But
and then they peel.
I like them. I've never had a taste like this before. I can't tell you any other nut that it tastes like exactly.
Yeah.
And
well,
it's
I want to
soft.
try it out.
Yeah.
So, a little bit of salt was kind of it's better with that, right?
I preferred them when I did them at home
Okay,
with those
let's
salt.
try this out. So I'm trying to figure out what this nut tastes like, and it
It's kind of creamy. It's not strong nutty.
Definitely. No,
It's sweet.
Very
I think,
sweet.
compared to walnuts and other
but
holiday
there's
nuts.
nothing that really comes right to mind. But we don't normally. Well, I guess we do have like hot peanuts, right? Other
Yeah.
things that we cook, nuts that we cook.
Yeah.
But this has got a completely soft texture, almost like slightly too hard mashed potatoes. You know how mashed potatoes kind of have that, if you don't cook them quite enough, there's a little texture there. So they have that, and it's a good texture.
They're very mild.
They're mild, they're sweet, but they don't say, you don't think, oh, that's just like some other nut, right?
Right,
They're
right.
totally, they're chestnuts. They're not anything else.
I can't tell you what they did to perk them up in our time period. But modern research, when I was just researching how to get the things out of the shells, they're using oils and butters. They're infusing them with herbs, with spices.
Oh, for extra flavor?
For
or
extra
whatever?
flavor,
Yeah.
right. It could be tarragon. It's
I don't think they need anything else.
I think these are fine, but they do have a drizzle that you could drizzle on. And in one case, I read that they soaked them in wine before they cooked them in the first place. I didn't try that.
So-
but
Yeah. I could definitely see them as a street food, but you would get them right out of the roaster. You know, they'd probably give them to you just a little warm,
Right.
and then you would eat them quickly while they were still warm, or else you wouldn't be able to get them apart.
I think it's really important to soak them ahead of time. And maybe I didn't soak them long enough. We soaked them for maybe 45 minutes this afternoon before we introduced them to the skillet. And it's possible they should have absorbed more water and been in there longer. They were kind of tough to cut. I don't think I cut them through enough because of this. Proper ones, the whole thing peeled back.
I don't know. Sometimes it worked.
Yeah.
I mean, even when it was,
Yeah.
you just can't let them get cold, or else you can't peel them.
Right.
Yeah. So this one it just doesn't work.
And I can't weigh in. There were some instances where people recommended to just slice it
Halfway.
halfway.
Right.
We elected to do the cross because more people, from what I read, did them that way. I can't tell you which is easier or better.
Yeah.
I don't think we soaked them enough, and I think we peeled them when they were starting to get cool. I think those two things made it difficult for us because the ones that were almost too hot to touch peeled. That's where we got these successful ones from.
Yeah.
And they look great. They taste. I think they taste good.
Yeah.
So success.
I think they're very successful. I wish we still had plenty of chestnuts to eat, but we don't around here.
Yep.
It would be something pretty prolific. Chestnut trees were very, very common, and you would have lots of chestnuts
Yeah.
to eat. So we've all heard the Christmas song. This is what they're talking about, and it's wonderful. It's a great opportunity to get a chance to eat something that they would have had very, very commonly in the 18th century. So thank you so much, Michael, for bringing that in.
welcome.
Oh, and Michael's new cookbook is out. Make sure to check it out. It's on the website, and it's a tremendous way of kind of talking about and understanding how we connect with history, not just thinking about it 200 years ago, but our personal history, our ancestry that goes back to that kind of time. How do we connect with those ancestors from 200 years ago? Food is a great way of doing that, understanding food. So great job on that cookbook.
Thank you so much.
Make sure to check that out. Thank you so much for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Soul cakes. What are soul cakes? I connect them with alms or giving to the poor during the holiday season. This soul cake, goes back to Druid times, pre-Christian Britain. When Christianity enters Britain, it turns into a series of celebrations during what we consider Halloween now. All Hallows Day, All Saints Day, and All Souls Day. It starts out being a way to release a soul from purgatory so that it can enter heaven. If you give a cake to the poor, a beggar at your door during this time period, they promise to pray for that beloved soul that may be in purgatory, and it was thought that each soul cake that was consumed released a soul from purgatory and let them enter heaven.
We're in the kitchen today with our special friend and guest, Michael Dragoo, and he has brought an interesting holiday-related recipe called soul cakes. It's one I have never heard of before. So, Michael, tell me a little bit about soul cakes?
Sure, I didn't know much about them either. We sing it in a certain holiday song, but I didn't know what it was. And it goes back to Druid, to pre-Christian Britain and Ireland. And it's an opportunity for people who have wealth to give to the poor. It's happening when what we consider Halloween, but there were Christian holidays, Druid celebrations that turn into Christian holidays during the same time period.
So do we know what the early recipes were like, or what are you basing this recipe on?
I went through, I've got 60 or 62 period correct reproduction cookbooks, and I couldn't find a reference to them. And sometimes it's because it's so archaic, but sometimes it's so common. Why would you have a recipe? Because most of these books are talking about special ways of preparing something.
Sure.
This might have been so mundane that it wasn't thought to be put in a cookbook. But in essence, it's a pound cake. Pound of flour, pound of sugar, pound of butter.
Right. That shows up in a lot of different English cookery, American cookery in the early 18th century. So very, very simple. No leavening. It's just a sort of
it's nope. And but they do special things to it. Sometimes it's a little extra sugar. Sometimes it's dried fruits. I don't care for raisins, so I brought blueberries and cranberries today. So,
and you put those in a particular design, so you know what's going on.
Thank you. The cookie is crossed. It's cut or pressed, indented with the sign of the cross, and then that can just be as it is, or you can make it a little more special by highlighting that cross with the dried fruits, and that's what I've chosen to do today. The recipe I've chosen today is fairly simple. It includes 3/4 cups of butter, 3/4 cups of sugar, 1.5 cups of flour, 3 egg yolks, 2 teaspoons of mixed spices. We've got some dried fruit of some type, 1/2 cup of milk, and then for making it pretty, we've either using coarse granulated sugar or some powdered sugar, and that's it. Well, first we're just going to incorporate the sugar and the butter together and get that combined as best we can. Then we're going to add the 3 egg yolks. That will aid in this mixing process. Once that's thoroughly combined, then we're going to add some flour. When it gets a little thick, we're going to add a little milk and just keep going back and forth until we're done with our 1.5 cups of flour. We want to sneak up on the milk so we don't get too moist mixed here. We're looking for just what your regular cookie dough consistency would be today. All right, John, if you could start adding some flour to this. Go a little more. Thank you. Yes, sir, if you could put a little milk in. We're just sneaking up on this. I don't want to put too much liquid in at first, even though I set an amount. Every single time it's a little different. So we're going to use all of our flour, the 1.5 cups of flour, and then we're going to use as much milk as we need, remembering that we've already got 3 egg yolks in here.
So you ended up with this recipe. Where did it come from?
You know, I couldn't find one static, consistent recipe. These several people, I had 4 or 5 from England, stating that these were following along the lines of original recipes, and I kind of combined them. They all were very similar in the basic pound cake treatment.
Right. This reminds me of the Jumbles recipe from the 17th century that you'll find. And it's sort of also related to a specific kind of the same recipe, but they make it in a different form.
Right.
Even the little antlers recipe that we did a couple
With
years ago
ivy,
for Christmas,
yep.
that one's the same thing, but instead of baking it, you cook it in hot oil.
Yes. No, this is
Very similar.
very similar. The
Similar, yeah.
thicknesses were very similar, although I found some references to what we would consider to be little cakes, things that were maybe 4 or 5 inches, but they're still
Right.
very dense. There's no
Sure.
leavening
No
at all. No, sir. Can you add a little more milk?
Sure.
What I found, I was hoping for some golden egg that had everything that was right 1,000 years ago, and I found no such thing. I almost think that, so many of our recipe books that we draw from 1600s, 1700s into early 1800s are making an ordinary dish special, or just doing special, something out of the blue that's just nutty and crazy and that you never would have thought to do yourself. I almost think that this is so mundane, so everyday and average that there was no reason to put it in print. And just, in the 17 and 18 and 1900s, and then today, it just fell out of favor. There were lots of times to give to the poor, not just one time a year. It just stops being connected with saving souls, as one might say. I know that I read that there are some places in the world, perhaps in the Philippines, some counties in England that still practice the symbolism.
So far, we don't have any spices in this.
That's true, and we're about to add the spices. I was talking to your guys a couple days ago, and then again this morning, and they have said how nice you've been lately. And that's not up to me to decide how rare that might be, but I thought, well, if maybe you should get a gift for being nice. And
Really?
it is the holidays, so if you'd open that,
Well,
please.
let's find out what's in here. It's very nicely wrapped.
It is, yes. It was last minute wrapped, and
Well, let's see. Wait for
what
it.
is it?
Yeah.
This is the
this
only
is what I
time-
always wanted.
I know that, and I need about half of that in there. So
Okay.
go to it.
Where's the grater?
I don't know. For the first time ever, he doesn't have
They turned out beautiful.
They turned out beautiful.
They look great.
Yep.
They smell great. If you were here, you would
Yeah.
like this because they're right. These are right out of the oven. So they look good, and we sprinkled that nice powdered sugar on them. We call it powdered sugar today. They had the same kind of thing. They would call it searsed sugar, where they would grind it up, make it finer for fancy sort of things like this, or make it look neat. We bake these at around 375. Start looking at them around 15 minutes, and they'll start to get a brown edge at 17 or 18 minutes, and out they come. Let's give them a try.
Go to it.
I'm gonna try one of these. I love these dried blueberries, and these are unleavened, other than this butter and sugar thing. And oh, nice and soft and puffed up. They're perfect. They might as well be leavened, even though they don't have any special leavening agent. Very good. So good.
You can make them just as special as you want. Extra sugar. In many cases, they asked for dried fruit. I don't prefer raisins, so I had cranberries at home. I had cherries and blueberries. We used cherries and blueberries for this. Plus, we made some without. And these are wonderful.
Texture's perfect.
Yeah.
It has that nutmeg in it, which you gotta have that. And that gives it, again, we expect that for a holiday seasoning, right?
Yeah.
So, and it does come right up to the top.
Yeah,
It's really
you would
good.
ask if the recipe included allspice. There's no reason why it couldn't. This one didn't.
Right.
But there's no reason why you couldn't.
Right. But it's that same
holiday
combination of
cinnamon,
holiday
nutmeg
spices.
for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Cloves. This has some cloves in it.
So good. I could
very
eat
good.
these all day long.
We will eat these all day long.
Michael, thank you so much for bringing this recipe in. A great
Certainly.
holiday recipe, wonderful, easy to do, and has a rich history. It goes
Yeah.
way back. And speaking of that, your cookbook that's out, talk about rich history. Lots of rich history, connection with, our personal histories and how we look that up, and filled with recipes
important.
from the 18th century. So make sure to check out Michael's new cookbook. You'll find a link down in the description section. Excellent. I want to thank you for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century, and Merry Christmas.